the laziest Kryptonian in the Marvel Universe. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction, so please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story and all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter, and if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 126: The Difference Between Geniuses. Wow, Henry let out a long sigh. Mr. Fantastic had truly offended the future Iron Man, to have such a grudge against him. However, this also made Henry notice something. While both Iron Man and Mr. Fantastic are among the Marvel Universe's most talented minds, their personalities differ. Beyond the superhero aura, Mr. Fantastic is a pure scientist, while Iron Man is a capitalist first and a scientist second. In other words, Mr. Fantastic's greatest strength is his intellect, while Iron Man's true strength lies in his financial resources. So, it seems that Mr. Fantastic Reed Richards' life consists of messing up and cleaning up messes, coupled with a quest for funding. According to the film, even marriage was a matter of time. In one version, he even considered leaving Sue, believing that women would only hinder his scientific research. Had his wife not married someone from his team, keeping the wealth within his family, Mr. Fantastic would likely have remained single for the rest of his life. Henry, however, was somewhat confused by the mindset of these scientific giants, so he asked, even if Mr. Richards thinks his research is too advanced, he should be able to come up with some scraps. It doesn't have to be too good, just a little bit beyond existing technology. That should be enough to satisfy the wolves and tigers on Wall Street. Isn't he even willing to do that? Tony said, because to do that, he'd have to hand over his research first before others can do the downgrade research. Or maybe he'd conduct the downgrade research himself, but that guy won't hand over his results, and he doesn't want to waste his time on downgrade research, so everyone who's worked with him complains. Henry finally understood and said, that's why some people criticize him, saying he's a funding scam. Yes, what does your father think? Henry asked. After all, Tony Stark is just a rich kid who messes around in school and picks up girls in Hollywood. The head of Stark Industries is his biological father, Howard Stark. Henry was curious whether that person's ideas were as extreme as his son's. While Tony was somewhat displeased by the mention of that person, he was still deeply impressed by Howard, also a leading scientific expert's assessment of Reed Richards. He said, the old man's assessment was that anything that surpasses Earth's technology by 30 or more years is just a flashy toy. It's fine to propose, but not worth the effort to realize. Besides, so-called future technology will inevitably obsolete some older technologies, which will touch the red lines of certain vested interests. Unless he's willing to share his profits, these people will inevitably become obstacles to his business, or perhaps he has immense political power, enough to shield him from dissent. Even then, political power comes at the cost of personal gain. Until that guy learns this, his current situation won't change. Oh, that was truly the assessment of a veteran capitalist, perfectly in line with America's current state and values. Or perhaps it was Howard Stark's own personal experience along the way. Henry asked curiously, your father didn't intend to hire such a talent? After a pause, Tony shook his head and said, I don't think he would hire someone who looked so much like him. And we have no obligation to teach him these things, do we? If he's truly talented, he'll find his own way to success, but how many talents have been lost? Henry thought of Anne Vanko and Ivan Vanko, two generations of people with ties to the Stark family. Although he didn't know if this Russian father and son existed in this world, and whether the story was as he knew, Tony's tone suddenly changed, returning to an angry tone. Don't you think these people are crazy? They don't let others use the research they've done, and they don't even want others to know about it. Then why do they do all this research? Richards was like that. I heard from the old man that he also met a nasty guy named Hank, who had the same problem. Now it was Henry's turn to regret why he didn't bring a portable recorder with him. If he had recorded what he said today, when the U.S. Department of Defense asked Iron Man to hand over his armor in the future, Henry would play it to the future Tony Stark. Just look at the expression of this genius when he was hit by the boomerang from his past. What a pity. Slightly restraining his interest in watching the show, Henry slapped a bone conduction microphone switch on his neck and said, now coming our Bloomberg CEO, Mr. Mike Bloomberg and his wife, Mrs. Susan Brown? It turned out that on the other side, the Starks, whose conversation had exceeded the time limit, finally ended and stopped taking up Audrey Hepburn's time. Another group of heavyweights took over. Watching Henry's actions, Tony pointed to the gadget on his neck and said, "You can make something like this, so why are you content to be a small assistant? As long as you want, not to mention building a big company, you can have enough food and clothing. Just like me." "Like you? I don't have a good father," Henry said defiantly. "Huh? Ever since I started college, I've earned all my living expenses myself. I haven't relied on anyone else." "Really? Where does that come from? Patent licensing fees? Then do you know roughly how long it takes to apply for a patent?" Henry asked. "I don't know. It's handled by lawyers. It should be done in a few days," the ignorant Tony said confidently. Henry scoffed. "Oh, a few days. The average application time for a patent, including the examination process, is 7 to 11 months. During this time, large companies usually learn about the patent's contents. If they were interested, they'll negotiate with the owner. If they can't reach an agreement, they'll naturally have other options. But don't assume that selling a patent to a large company means you can safely collect the profits. Many large companies would rather spend a fortune to hide a patented technology that conflicts with their business than allow anyone else to profit from it. Therefore, the idea of making money from patents has an invisible barrier for the average person. Without Stark Industries' legal team as a backing, ordinary people can still hold on to patents. This only proves that the big players don't see this technology as viable and can only make a small profit. Or, they have easily achievable alternatives, so please don't say that making money from patents is easy. From this perspective, it's easy to understand why Mr. Richards doesn't use his research findings to raise funds. Chapter 127 Cliché. The innocent man is guilty of possessing a treasure is a concept left over from our ancestors over 2,000 years ago. Do you really think this beacon of freedom and democracy could be any different? Patents are nominally intended to protect inventors' incomes, but in reality, they are merely a legal weapon used by large corporations to build technological barriers and secure profits. Consider the Edison versus Tesla battle of the century between direct current and alternating current. Jiang Wenman, the inventor of the VCD player, watched this world-class pie in the sky, ultimately only to sigh in despair. Japanese engineer Masahiro, the inventor of the QR code, watched helplessly as his patent expired before the device became widely popular. Believe it or not, if Henry patents the complete technical specifications for DVD+R and DVD-R today, Philips and Toshiba will join forces tomorrow to promote DVD-R specifications. Just like in the future new energy war, Japan will patent almost all of the core hydrogen battery technologies, building a solid patent barrier. And then the world will stop using hydrogen batteries. The same idea. Do you really think hydrogen batteries are dangerous when they explode, but lithium batteries are less flammable? So the idea of registering 1 or 2 core patents and then making money is completely unrealistic. If you want to go that route, you could just change the title of your book to Marvel's Kryptonian, The Business Empire, and spend all day beating up your competitors with your fists. Come on. The American dream is really that easy to live. Do you know what survivorship bias is? Only the good things are preserved and recorded. Because the tragic things never even have the chance to be known, they disappear into the depths of some ditch. Compared to Henry's perspective, Tony Stark's change of heart is even more shocking. It's said that perspective determines a person's stature. Some argue that in the MCU's worldview, Iron Man's inferiority to Rocket Raccoon is simply due to Tony's lack of knowledge of alien technology. In Tony Stark's original world, he was completely unaware of the complexities behind patents because no one had told him, and it wasn't something he saw on a daily basis. The services of the group's lawyers were as natural and common to him as sunlight, air, and water. Once someone pierced that window paper, his brilliant mind would naturally discern truth from falsehood, right from wrong. However, emotions don't directly correlate with right and wrong. Sometimes, the right answer can even make people more angry. Tony Stark was in this exact situation. He looked disapprovingly at the overindulging assistant before him and said, "Are you trying to say that my current situation is all thanks to the Stark name?" Henry laughed. "What else, young master? You don't think that only pocket money from your parents counts as money from your family? And that joining Stark Industries and becoming CEO or a senior executive is considered receiving help from your parents, right? Besides, You can just borrow an active battleship in Hollywood to pick up girls. You wouldn't say that you were able to borrow that ship from the Department of Defense because of your connections, right? Oh, Tony Stark. Tony had no intention of deceiving himself about such definitions. He asked directly, then how do you think I can truly start from scratch, strip off completely? Walk out barebutt and start begging? No, of course not. I just think your idea is stupid. You might as well just put your IQ in a bank and start from scratch. If you want to criticize a genius's mind as stupid, you'd better have a good reason. Tony was still dissatisfied and questioned. Henry said, Carl Lewis wouldn't think his athletic talent was a mistake. But without professional training, he wouldn't be able to shine on the international stage and break world records. President Roosevelt didn't rely on his polio to single-handedly make the United States a member of the victorious camp in World War II. What I'm saying is that the power you possess is not a shameful thing. It's how you use it, the actions and results, that determine whether you bring honor to yourself or bring shame to yourself. Haha, what should I say? What a bunch of cliches. There is no way to know what Tony, with an expressionless face, feels in his heart. But there is disdain in his tone. The young master looked at the person in front of him with disdain and said, what's the point of hiding here as a little assistant? It's very interesting. After a few awkward laughs, Henry said, if you ask me, it's okay even if you are mediocre. Take the money from home, drive a sports car, pick up girls, whatever, at least it's not a bad thing. And you know the theory of economic flow, money is only money when it flows. If you put it in a safe, leave it in a bank account, it's just a number. So it's right for you to spend it. Even on luxury goods. By the same token, money is enough. I don't want to marry 3 wives and 4 concubines, and have 17 or 18 children, so that I need to build a business empire, so that they can divide it up after I die, so that they don't starve to death. Why should people who are born extraordinary be content with being ordinary? The person who said this was Howard Stark, who was walking over. His wife Maria was beside him. Tony made an impatient expression, as if he wanted to run away. But he was suppressed well by his mother, and became a human stand to serve the plates. Maria used tongs to pick up some small cakes and put them on the plates. The big guy came over to talk, and Henry didn't seem too casual in front of him. Instead, after greeting him, he responded neither softly nor hard, Mr. Stark. People who are born extraordinary must first learn to restrain their desires and not abuse the power in their hands. If you can do this, then you can consider how to achieve extraordinary things. Maybe someone has tried their best in the first stage, so it's not a bad thing for him to be ordinary, although I want to refute you, you are not wrong. Is this why you would rather be a small assistant? Howard said. Seeing Henry's puzzled look, Howard tapped his ear and said, this little thing has a good idea, but it looks like he won't accept my invitation. Henry smiled and said, I'm a big fan of Ms. Hepburn. It makes me happy to be able to help her. What job is better than this? But Ms. Hepburn is doing an extraordinary career. It seems that your contribution to such a career goes against your requirement of being content with mediocrity. I'm just helping a lady I like and respect. If this is what he wants to do, then I will help. There's nothing to say. From a certain point of view, this is also a clear goal in life. This is much better than my child who doesn't know what to do. Henry found that he had become the child of other people's family and laughed awkwardly a few times. Tony, who was secretly insulted, responded with a smack of his lips. This was because his hand was caught by his mother, otherwise he would have turned around and ran away. Thanks to Zizian00777 for the reward. Chapter 128 The Dilemma of Stark Industries. In a world where Howard Stark still lived, should he warn his enemies to beware of Hydra assassinations? Anyone who did that would be an idiot. First, he had no evidence. Second, Henry wasn't sure how the old Starks would die in this world. He couldn't even pretend to be a prophet. Making irresponsible statements would simply jeopardize his limited credibility. Furthermore, if he guessed right, it would likely lead to even more trouble. After all, this was an internal SHIELD issue. Those on Stark's side would naturally question Henry's source of information, and those on Hydra's side would also want to know where the leak originated. In short, if he guessed right, he would attract the attention of both sides, focusing their attention on him. Even if he tried to pretend to be a charlatan, pretending to be able to divine and predict, he wouldn't be able to escape the trouble. Then there was the ulterior motive. Without sacrificing Tony's parents, how could Iron Man claim to have boundless power? Henry wasn't sure if stopping Iron Man was a good idea. Honestly, he wasn't trying to deliberately stabilize a particular historical trajectory, nor was he necessarily seeking to alter the future. From his own perspective, Howard Stark's life or death wouldn't benefit him. Making him owe a favor so he could gain access to Stark Industries or demand something else? That's no different than running to New York, the center of the universe, and shouting, "I'm a Kryptonian, everyone, shoot me." Henry hadn't forgotten his goal was to live a peaceful life, not get himself into trouble. So, what was his reason for influencing this matter? His friendship with Tony Stark? They'd met 5 times, and just because someone called him a friend, he took him seriously? It was like assuming your beloved had fallen in love with you at first sight after she glanced at you in a crowd. There's a limit to excessive self-awareness. Do you really think the Earth revolves around you? And the above thinking is simply based on the worldview of Marvel superheroes. If you were in this world, considering the economic situation, you'd realize it wasn't just Hydra who wanted Howard Stark dead. The Rockefeller family, once the undisputed leader in the oil industry, was broken up, and so too did the Carnegie family, the renowned steel magnates. It's said that the United States was founded on conglomerates, but when a conglomerate truly becomes so large as to dominate the nation, it inevitably faces dismantling. The famous antitrust laws provide the legal basis for this very purpose. Of course, there are countermeasures to every policy. These dismantled family businesses weren't condemned to extermination or confiscation, they were simply dispersed and concealed, moving from the public eye to the background. Thus, names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Rothschild vanished from public view. The only ones still visible were financial giants like Morgan. In the real world, few hold the same status as the oil giants or steel magnates of the past. The word almost is, of course, because there are exceptions. The exception is Stark Industries, founded by Howard Stark. Before the advent of Iron Man, Stark Industries was a military-industrial complex, part of the arms industry. Under Howard Stark's leadership, Stark Industries became a comprehensive enterprise, dabbling in everything. Even if Stark Industries didn't have a production line, it would have a laboratory. Basically, if Stark was interested in something, he'd try it. Just looking at the influence of Stark Industries in Hollywood reveals his dog-like nature, staking his claim. While Stark Industries might not rival established companies in a single field, such as Boeing in aviation, Lockheed Martin in defense, Ford in automotive, and Intel in chips, Stark Industries is a self-contained ecosystem, encompassing both upstream and downstream industries. In terms of comprehensive industrial strength, even the 2nd to 10th ranked companies combined in the United States, or even globally, might not be more powerful than Stark Industries. He has transformed the world's commercial landscape into one superpower, many strong nations situation. Just take one person like him. Who among those in power and business competitors could tolerate him? Even more damning, he has only one heir, Tony Stark. Simply put, if Howard Stark falls, a capital feast will unfold, no less spectacular than the fall of the Red Empire. Stark Industries will be the one on the table. The reason Stark Industries has grown to its current size is easy to imagine. Howard Stark has always had close ties with the military and was a founding member of the Strategic Scientific Reserve. After World War II, this agency was reorganized into the Strategic Homeland Defense Attack and Logistics Agency, better known as SHIELD, with the military as his backing and intelligence organizations within. Even a small fry could thrive, let alone Howard Stark. Even if they disliked him, those who wanted to touch him would find it difficult to do so. To put it more bluntly, if Howard Stark of this era wanted to enter the White House, he'd only need to signal his intention to rally a vast chorus of supporters. Even established political families would have to give way. It's said that the strongest fortresses crumble from within. Howard's death was orchestrated by Hydra, hidden within SHIELD. As for the seizure of the super soldier serum, it was more of a convenient act. No one can guarantee the effectiveness of Howard's restored serum. And judging by subsequent developments in the MCU, it certainly hasn't been effective. In short, if Howard Stark wants to survive today, Henry must provide 24/7 personal protection. Otherwise, even if he manages to fend off a Winter Soldier attack disguised as a car accident, there will likely be a second, third, and countless more until the assassination attempt succeeds. In this situation, Howard Stark can't expect a peaceful life unless he simply hands over Stark Industries and settles for some retirement shares or a pension. But would the elder Stark agree? It was obvious that this was impossible. Even if there was solid evidence, it wouldn't necessarily convince this scientist and entrepreneur who had experienced World War II, not to mention that Henry didn't have any evidence. So did Henry really need to save Howard? The truth was that it was neither necessary nor possible. This was a disaster that Stark Industries was bound to face, and it was also a hurdle in Tony Stark's ability to transform and grow. Just like the inevitable collapse of the Red Empire, Henry, a Kryptonian, wasn't even qualified to be a pawn in this situation. Not to mention profiting from it, at most he could pick up some insignificant scraps. After understanding this, Henry felt at ease to turn his attention back to his employer. No longer focusing on the trendsetters of the era. Audrey Hepburn's affairs were no less than anyone else's. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 129 Private Dinner. Beep, beep, beep. The specially crafted metal band on Audrey Hepburn's left wrist chimed. The woman touched it, and the chime stopped. He immediately stood up and headed for the hotel entrance. Just then, the waiter outside opened the door and walked in. Upon seeing Ms. Hepburn, he held the glass door open, preventing it from closing. He said, "Mom, your car is here, thank you," he said, handing over a tip. Audrey Hepburn approached the car. Henry, already waiting at the rear door, opened it just in time, holding the upper edge with his hand to prevent her from accidentally bumping her head, and helped her into the car. Driving his rented Volvo, Henry was ready to take Audrey Hepburn to the French restaurant they had booked a few days earlier for dinner. As for the woman's watch, the chiming metal band was a modification Henry had made. It simply enabled the other side to send a message, and this side to ring. Previous Bluetooth headsets had limited connection range, making them inconvenient. Sometimes, a simple alarm-like notification is all that's needed, not necessarily a conversation. So, Henry came up with this new gadget. Its function is simple: when Henry is ready, he can notify Ms. Hepburn via the watch strap. Like in the previous situation, he's already parked at the door and needs to notify her to come out. Conversely, when Henry isn't with Ms. Hepburn, the modified watch strap can also serve as a wake-up call, alerting her whereabouts that she's looking for him. This device is simply a transmitter, receiver, and buzzer. Anyone with the necessary knowledge can assemble it from any number of electronic parts. After hearing Henry's explanation, Ms. Hepburn didn't think these little gadgets were anything special, they just worked. However, those with more experience saw it differently. At the very least, it needed to be miniaturized enough to fit inside the metal strap of a woman's watch, but there aren't many electronic components that can be easily assembled into such a compact device. Henry's approach, however, was to leverage Kryptonian precision machining to create some handy little gadgets. As long as the concept isn't too far-fetched, these little gadgets won't really attract much attention, unless it's someone truly knowledgeable. By the way, Henry, yes, boss, after you hand over the car, come into the restaurant and dine with us, Audrey Hepburn said. Boss, isn't today a private meeting with a friend? Henry asked. Henry knew the other person was Hubert de Givenchy, a close friend of Ms. Hepburn's, who had come all the way from France to New York. Hepburn retorted, "Didn't I ask you to reserve 3 tables?" "Yes." "Isn't the third one a guest brought by Mr. Givenchy?" Audrey Hepburn said. "No, the third guest is you. There aren't any other restaurants nearby, and you're such a glutton. The chef at that restaurant really impressed me when I was in France with his oxtail soup. I think even you would be impressed. Just think of it as me trying to show off in front of you. Don't worry, I'll pay for the dinner and won't deduct any from your salary." "Thanks, boss." Henry didn't delay any further. As for the salary deduction, it was just Ms. Hepburn's sense of humor. He hadn't skimped on food and lodging, on the contrary, he was quite generous. Unless otherwise restricted by the organizers, Henry's food and lodging were on par with his own. It had just rained in New York today, so the ground was still a little wet. Some people walked the streets with umbrellas, others without, all hurried through the bustling city, stepping over the puddles. Audrey Hepburn couldn't truly enjoy the fast-paced city, but that didn't dampen his spirits as he was meeting a dear friend. Givenchy, who had previously run his own luxury brand, had recently joined LVMH as its creative director. Today, Mr. Givenchy had taken time out of his busy schedule to fly to New York to visit his dear friend, who had just survived a manhunt by local warlords and a forced plane landing in Africa. They soon arrived at the restaurant. Henry opened the car door and led the woman out. After handing the rental car to the valet at the door, he followed a woman into this upscale French restaurant, which was not accessible without a reservation. "Bang you, Mom. Mr. Givenchy is already waiting at the table you reserved. Please allow me to show you to your seat." The restaurant manager personally greeted the celebrity at the door. Henry had already mentioned the guest's identity during the reservation, so the manager was naturally extremely cautious. However, the guest's details weren't shared with the entire restaurant beforehand. They were generally kept private by the manager who took the reservation. This was to prevent staff from leaking them to paparazzi and potentially causing trouble for the restaurant's patrons. High-end restaurants like theirs, beyond basic concerns like cuisine and hygiene, also prioritized privacy and customer protection. At the very least, the staff had been trained to remain calm, regardless of the situation. If a celebrity or famous person came, the staff would grumble and scramble for autographs and photos, and those who had been there probably wouldn't want to return. Of course, there are restaurants that cultivate this kind of intimate atmosphere, but most celebrities visit high-end restaurants simply to avoid being treated like zoo apes. They've been living like monkeys enough on a regular basis, and when they need a break, no one wants to put on a business smile. They need to be incredibly friendly to everyone they meet. The atmosphere in the restaurant was relaxed, not the kind of strict atmosphere where the chef and manager are so mad that diners are only allowed to eat the food and nothing else, not even conversation, is allowed. The interior layout and lighting were bright, allowing for a normal dinner. It wasn't the kind of dim, gloomy atmosphere that used special lighting to color the food and create an ambiguous atmosphere. Ms. Hepburn, led by the restaurant manager, entered the restaurant. An elegant, elderly gentleman, upon seeing her, rose joyfully to greet her. "Givenchy, Audrey," the two exchanged warm kisses on the cheek. For Givenchy, the man who founded his own luxury brand, his last name represented him, and he was proud of it. Therefore, regardless of personal connection, everyone addressed him as Givenchy, rather than by name or nickname. "Who is this young man?" Givenchy asked kindly, looking at Henry. "Oh, this is my new assistant, Henry Brown. A very interesting guy. I'm thinking I'll introduce you to someday, Ms. Hepburn said with a playful smile. Hearing this, Henry had a bad feeling. However, he still extended his hand and introduced himself to the fashion tycoon, Henry Brown. "Mr. Givenchy, it's a great honor to meet you today." Chapter 130 Givenchy. Givenchy personally pulled out a chair and seated Audrey Hepburn. Judging by their demeanor as they chatted, they didn't look like an old married couple who knew everything about each other, but rather like someone still deeply in love. Even their gazes were captivating. Watching them from the sidelines, Henry couldn't help but think of a term not yet used in this era, male bestie. While it's true that this term has acquired a host of negative connotations since its introduction, there's no better term to refer to a female friend of the opposite sex, one whose relationship is more than just friendship. No wonder both of Hepburn's husbands resented the fashion tycoon. Anyone would be unbearable to see their wife gaze at another man with such radiant affection. Yet, the distance between them wasn't one of crossing the final line, but rather one of unbridled affection, freely expressing their feelings just before that line. As the first person to witness this up close, Henry couldn't help but wonder, which is more serious, emotional or physical infidelity? What are the boundaries between men and women? The three of them took their seats, and a waiter arrived to pour water and present menus. However, the two old friends didn't even glance at them. Audrey Hepburn simply said to the waiter, "Give us a surprise." No menu dining wasn't popular back then. But in bars and some Western restaurants, when diners didn't have a specific food or drink craving, they might leave the choice to the chef. Henry, however, excused himself and explained the two's health conditions to the waiter, asking the chef to avoid certain flavors. For example, Hepburn's thinness wasn't the result of dieting or training. It was the result of her childhood starvation during the war, which had damaged her health. And then there were the years of traveling, which had left her with a weak stomach. Mr. Givenchy was in excellent health, but considering he'd made time to fly in from France, perhaps even going directly from the airport to the restaurant, he was somewhat fatigued. Looking at the restaurant wall, which displayed not only his chef's license but also his German nutritionist's certificate, Henry believed the situation he just described was enough for the chef to make his own judgment. By the time Henry returned to his seat, the two friends were already chatting. Givenchy said distressedly, Didn't that just happen to you? Why are you going to Africa again? Because there are people who need help. What other reason could there be? Audrey Hepburn said matter-of-factly. So you're leaving tomorrow? No more rest for a few days? I thought I was busy enough as a designer and the group's creative director. I didn't expect you, now retired from acting, to have an even more frantic schedule. How long has it been since you've been home to Switzerland to rest? Life goes on, the struggle never ceases. My time is dwindling, and there's still so much to do. I'll eventually have a chance to rest, but until then, I hope to do more for the world, to leave more good. Oh, Audrey. You've accomplished so much more than I have. Even so, you're so greedy that you think it's not enough. The two of them, of a certain age, had long since moved beyond the stage of striving for achievement and were now contemplating their own legacy. But the mention of that taboo word inevitably cast a somber tone. Audrey Hepburn was far more positive. He quickly steered clear of the potentially catastrophic topic, patting Henry on the shoulder as he returned to his seat. Do you know how I met this kid? Had Henry been addressing anyone else, he would have retorted. But Givenchy, understandingly, shook his head and said, I don't know. Was it an interesting experience? Catherine introduced him to me, Hepburn said maliciously. Catherine, Givenchy asked, mentioning another mutual friend. Is he okay now? Don't worry. Catherine is much stronger than I am. The funny thing is, Catherine told me that when the kid first met him, he said, oh, it's this Ms. Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn mimed a look of disappointment, perfectly reminiscent. As expected, the subject was brought up again, and Henry smiled wryly. Givenchy, for he too had been the subject of such remarks. After a pause, he looked at Henry and asked unhappily, really? Removing his hand from covering his face, Henry replied helplessly, yes, sir. I know a friend in Los Angeles who I'm not very close to, and he heard from somewhere that I admired Ms. Hepburn, so he lured me in with a private dinner invitation with Ms. Hepburn. In my excitement, I forgot there were actually two Ms. Hepburns in Hollywood, so I acted rather impolitely with the other one. I almost had to go to the hospital to have my nose fixed. It was the kind of thing where you're so dislocated you can't sue. Knowing the whole story, Givenchy chuckled and said, oh, that makes me lucky. At least the person I offended didn't want to fix it. Katharine Hepburn's punch to Howard Stark's nose is a timeless legend in Hollywood. What the Allied soldiers in World War II couldn't do, a Hollywood woman accomplished. Everyone knows the incident is true, but there are no photographs, and no one knows the details except the person involved. So to this day, journalists still like to ask this question whenever they meet either of these two. In short, having produced two equally ugly male protagonists, there was an inexplicable sense of kinship. It was as if they were comrades who had served in the same trench. Givenchy also understood why Audrey Hepburn wanted to introduce this young assistant to him. It turned out that she was making fun of the misunderstanding during their initial meeting. The two Hepburn ladies' bad tastes were always highly consistent at certain times. This made it impossible for these grown men to get angry at all. It was much easier for men to get acquainted than for women. With this common ground as a bond, Givenchy also had a slight interest in Hepburn's young assistant. He looked at the man in the cheap suit. In the eyes of this fashion tycoon, any suit that was not handmade was a cheap product. Although the Armani suit he was wearing was an unexpected expense for Henry, the young man asked curiously, I know many people have unrealistic fantasies about celebrities and stars, people they can't actually meet, only seeing through newspapers and media. They imagine they're all perfect. Once they meet them in person, most are disappointed, even angry that we don't live up to their expectations. What about you, kid? What are your thoughts on becoming Audrey Hepburn's assistant? The question was a tricky one, and Henry wondered if the fashion tycoon was posing it to exclude the men around his woman. But Ms. Hepburn was equally intrigued, staring at him with wide eyes that threatened to turn into a death stare at any moment. Chapter 131 on Acting Skills. Not intending to dodge the question, Henry said seriously, First, sir, let me know. Before becoming your boss's assistant, I worked as an actor in Hollywood for several months. I was a background character in a movie, just walking around, with no lines or camera work, but that didn't stop me from observing famous actors and pondering their so-called acting skills. Some are so-called method actors, others experiential actors. Others cite expressionism, but these approaches are actually the responsibility of the director and have little to do with the actor. Regardless of the method an actor uses to hone their acting, some succeed, some fail, and some are criticized for acting as if they're playing themselves in any role. In fact, all acting techniques emphasize one thing: allowing the actor to immerse themselves in the role and become it, rather than simply impersonating it. But why do some succeed while others don't? I believe those who succeed have the necessary qualities inherent in their personalities, which the director then refines, because the entire atmosphere of the scene serves this character. The two complement each other perfectly. This is truly the ideal of expressionist presentation. If the director's skills aren't good enough, it's easy for the actors to simply perform their own evaluations. In fact, in my opinion, everyone is performing themselves. It's just a certain part of themselves, not the whole self. The reason, of course, is that this film, this scene, this shot requires this part of themselves, not the rest. Of course, I'm not saying that those actors who play murderers or criminals with such impressive performances are actually murderers or criminals. Rather, they amplify certain aspects of their own personalities, collaborating with the director to create the characters that the audience perceives. It's undeniable that these people must have this kind of brutality in their personalities to be able to perform such performances on the big screen. But as Freud emphasized, people are multifaceted, not singular. Furthermore, the legal and moral frameworks of modern society restrict people's behavior. For example, we all know that casually beating someone up will result in legal liability and compensation, but there is no need to worry about these things in the movie. It is a fictional world, and what it needs is conflict. Conflicts of human nature, conflicts with fists. Even those seemingly bland movies have conflicts of ideas. So even if these actors may have some bad parts in their personalities, it does not mean that their behavior must be like that. There is violence hidden in everyone's heart, but isn't the purpose of our learning to be human to prevent these hidden things from ever appearing? In short, I now believe that an actor's performance in a movie is actually to reveal a part of himself. Then, with the help of the director and others, relying on the plot, scenery, and the interaction with other characters, this self is disguised as another person. So looking back, will I be disappointed because I like Princess Anna, Sister Luke, Holly Golightly, and Eliza Dodd in the movie, and then feel that Ms. Hepburn is not exactly like these characters? Of course not. Because in my eyes, Audrey Hepburn is not only the princess who shook hands with everyone just to shake a reporter's hand and say goodbye properly, but also Natasha Rostova, who remained innocent even in war and grew because of it. And Susie Hendrick, who outwitted and outmaneuvered evildoers. He's one person, and everyone. I even got to know Audrey Hepburn better by seeing him up close. As a moviegoer, what could be more fortunate than that? Disappointment? There's no such thing. In fact, the restaurant had already started serving the food while Henry was speaking. But the two listeners were too stunned to eat. Audrey Hepburn, a former actress, naturally resonated most deeply with Henry's remarks about acting. She couldn't deny that even if she didn't have certain negative traits in her own personality, she had to try to understand them and then act them out in order to act. In this way, even if those traits weren't originally there, they would become present. Otherwise, there wouldn't be the saying that some people get so immersed in a role that they can't get out of it. Although Givenchy wasn't an actor, as a fellow admirer of Audrey Hepburn, he felt Henry's words were absolutely correct. The Audrey Hepburn in the film wasn't his whole self, it was merely a facade, a part of him, created to serve the film's role. The real Audrey was far richer, and in her every smile and expression, he could always glimpse the beauty that captivated him. Givenchy couldn't help but sigh. Audrey, I finally understand why you told me this kid was so interesting and worth getting to know. Henry, right? I like you too, boy. You've truly expressed what I was thinking in the most complete terms. Thank you for your approval, sir, Henry replied calmly. However, they both noticed that Ms. Hepburn was fanning herself, blushing and gulping down the water and wine on the table in one gulp, which was a source of amusement. Givenchy gestured for the waiters to refill the woman's glass. At the same time, he jokingly asked, "It's autumn now, isn't it? Is it really that hot? Or is the heater on in the restaurant?" Audrey Hepburn, after downing another glass of water, finally calmed down a bit. He rolled his eyes at his best friend of decades and said, "You should know, I used to read the critics' reviews in the newspapers, and thankfully, I read them in the papers. Otherwise, I'd be furious and want to punch someone, or too embarrassed to speak. Today, I can't avoid it, so I have to hear all this in person. You two should consider me, the person involved, for a moment, you damned fellow, ha ha ha." Givenchy nudged Henry with his elbow, satisfied, and whispered, "Big stars like this aren't something ordinary moviegoers see. I usually don't tell others about the benefits of being their friends." Suddenly, Givenchy stood up, raised his glass, and said, "A toast to the beauty of our golden age, a cultural treasure, and the eternal star of cinema, Ms. Audrey Hepburn." In fact, as early as when Ms. Hepburn entered the restaurant, someone had recognized this big star. After all, most of the people who can afford such a place are old guys who have come through that era. When Henry was talking, he didn't deliberately lower his voice, nor did he speak to everyone like a speech. But most of the other customers in the restaurant were also distracted and listened. When Givenchy raised his glass to toast, everyone who was in a playful mood actually raised their glasses at the same time as Henry and shouted, "Cheers to the eternal Audrey Hepburn." The embarrassed big star could only stand up with a red face and toast everyone in the restaurant. Dinner time was spent in a happy mood. Chapter 132 Busy Schedule. Henry, accompanied by Audrey Hepburn, once again visited a UN-supported child protection agency, accompanied by UNICEF personnel. The visit wasn't limited to Africa. Impoverished countries in South Asia, Central America, and South America were also included. This time, neither Ms. Hepburn nor the UN personnel dared to travel separately, as they had done previously, when visiting areas suspected of conflict. They were accompanied and protected by peacekeeping troops throughout the trip, and of course, they also provided private security teams provided by insurance companies. His collaboration with Brian Mills and others was limited to that unsuccessful Somalia visit. After that, he often worked with different security teams, without a single set. It wasn't that he didn't want to stick with a fixed team, but for such mission-based work, scheduling them together required synergy between both parties' schedules. Some people, after making a fortune, don't want to work until they've squandered it all. Therefore, if they wanted to have a fixed security team, they had to sign a long-term contract. Even days away from Africa would still be charged. Considering that these teams were provided by insurance companies, these businessmen naturally couldn't afford to overpay. They could only work with a different team each time. Fortunately, Ms. Hepburn's security was simple, primarily with UN personnel at the forefront. No matter how chaotic the African continent, these blacks wouldn't dare to provoke the blue-hatted peacekeeping forces. Traveling to other places outside of Africa was even simpler, relying on local government police or military escorts. The Somali incident was an exception among exceptions. Moreover, after Henry and his companions fled, the African country erupted in civil war, with various warlords rising up. Ms. Hepburn had the misfortune of entering the country on the eve of the civil war. As everyone knows, the early stages of any major turmoil are when the most unusual people are present. After several rounds of survival of the fittest, the unhinged will be eliminated, or they will become so strong that normal people will avoid them. This is why some people would take advantage of a Hollywood star's absence from UN protection and attempt to kidnap her. Generally speaking, UN-organized events are quite reliable, especially when it comes to security. After all, Ms. Hepburn was their trademark. If it were damaged, it would be a serious loss of face. If it were the 5 biggest gangsters in the UN slamming the table, they would just stand at attention, no room for negotiation. But a bunch of third-world blacks dared to insult the UN. This was truly intolerable. Henry's private dealings with peacekeepers revealed that shortly after the Somali incident, peacekeeping troops entered southern Somalia for live-fire exercises. It's said that area is now the most peaceful in a country now embroiled in civil war. But a major reason Audrey Hepburn felt so reassured was, of course, the presence of Henry, their assistant. A special person who could fly and was bulletproof always brought peace of mind. As for the sheer magnitude of the task of lifting a small passenger plane, Ms. Hepburn didn't quite understand. If he had discussed this with others, perhaps someone would have explained the difficulty involved. Although Henry didn't specifically ask Ms. Hepburn to keep his secret, Audrey respected her assistant's wishes and never revealed a single detail about the experience. When asked, she would simply give a formulaic public relations answer. As for the other abilities she displayed during the evacuation, such as her advanced sensory driving and marksmanship, they might have aroused the attentive Brian's suspicions. But that was within the normal range, or perhaps just a stroke of luck, so no one noticed. Regardless, having Henry by her side certainly made Audrey Hepburn's job much easier. Ms. Hepburn never considered forcing Henry to do more important or greater work. After all, he was currently assisting the United Nations in providing aid to children in the Third World. Could anything be more important or greater? Jumping into a battleground and directly persuading both sides to cease fighting? Audrey Hepburn didn't believe Henry was capable of such a thing. So, helping him was a good thing. At least it was better than being a minor actor in Hollywood. Or perhaps this assistant was simply too useful. Henry took care of most of the trivial matters during the visit. Audrey Hepburn would simply visit a location, play with the children, and take a photo. The rest of her daily routine consisted of reviewing Henry's draft report and making any necessary revisions. After several reviews, Ms. Hepburn simply stopped making revisions. Once she'd read it through and approved it, she'd sign it and submit it as the official report. After her visit, she'd return to New York to present the report at the United Nations. She'd usually attend fundraisers and extort large sums of money from the wealthy. And then, off she went. Henry finally understood where Mr. Givenchy's criticism of Audrey Hepburn as too crazy came from. Each round trip back and forth between a third-world country and New York would take the better part of a month. Ms. Hepburn could make 2 or 3 such trips in a row, then return to her home in Switzerland for a week or 2 before setting off again. To give you an idea of Ms. Hepburn's intensity, the term workaholic would have been coined 2 or 3 decades earlier. Even at home, Ms. Hepburn was never idle. She loved gardening and reading, both very time-consuming pursuits. Gardening, in particular, requires not only time but also physical effort. Henry didn't rest just because Hepburn returned to her home in Switzerland. The job he'd applied for included a driver role. So, he had his own small room in the beautiful villa. He drove her when she went out, and stayed at the villa to assist her during the day. Even though Hepburn had retired from acting, she still had plenty of contacts. The most important of them, of course, were UNICEF. Others included her property managers and investment managers. In his free time, he helped tend to her flowers and plants. Since he could only return to Switzerland once every month or 2, tending the gardens took a considerable amount of time. These tasks were easy for Henry. Using his Kryptonian abilities, he could complete them in a blink of an eye, and it didn't take him long. Gardening, after all, isn't about the results, but the quiet process of care. So, Henry didn't overstep his bounds and do everything for Hepburn. Since Henry still had some free time at night, he decided to move his computer from his Los Angeles apartment. The rent was still being paid monthly and he hadn't moved out, to work on some software. Incidentally, according to the original history, Linux appeared on news groups in August of that year and was uploaded to the Helsinki University of Technology's FTP server in September. The only change was that it wasn't just the kernel that was released. Instead, they collaborated with contributors on the Joker BBS and integrated some new components, creating an executable free operating system. This accelerated the process. Henry, using the username CK, joined the open-source software development frenzy. However, he couldn't constantly hang out on the BBS like everyone else. He simply remained a reclusive figure, occasionally releasing a Linux-based package. At the end of 1991, news shook the business world. Howard and his wife had died in a car accident. Chapter 133: The Heir's Dilemma. Although Audrey Hepburn hoped to spend her remaining time supporting UN charities and helping children in need, she didn't want to rest. Could she force others to work as hard as she did? For the Western world, the Christmas and New Year holidays at the end of the year are major events of the year. Not many people want to travel to Africa to celebrate with their black friends, nor to other impoverished countries. Spending time with family is much better. But even without any travel plans, there's plenty to do back home. The approaching Christmas holiday season is a time when many people are willing to donate generously. Besides being motivated by faith, it's also largely due to the tax-deductible nature of charitable donations. Wealthy individuals with tax deductions and accounting records need to get their accounts in order before the new year to avoid paying a hefty tax bill. Therefore, the period before the new year is a peak fundraising season. Audrey Hepburn, a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador since 1988, certainly didn't let these wealthy individuals off the hook. If they didn't donate, the government would have taken the money anyway. It's better to donate it to charity, which brings both prestige and tax savings. Besides the charity banquet, this is also the time when the Oscars publicity campaign begins. As a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Audrey Hepburn naturally has her share of social connections. However, she's based in New York and wouldn't be invited to fly to Los Angeles, the heart of Hollywood. However, on December 17th, just before Christmas, a piece of news shocked the nation. Howard Stark, the head of Stark Industries, and his wife, Maria Stark, were involved in a car accident. Reports indicate that the couple were driving home on the evening of the 16th when they braked on a remote road. They were found and reported to the police on the morning of the 17th, and a forensic inquest confirmed their death. This incident, of course, shocked the wealthy, primarily in the business community, the most. Even at the fundraising banquet, conversation inevitably turned to Stark Industries. It was clear to everyone that Stark Industries was facing a precarious situation. The question is, if the helmsman dies unexpectedly, are the heirs prepared? This preparedness isn't about Tony Stark's qualifications or abilities, it concerns a more practical aspect, estate planning. As we all know, the U.S. estate tax is as high as 45%. If legal safe haven transfers aren't made during a person's lifetime, upon death, heirs will have to pay nearly half the value of their estate. Furthermore, it's best to pay taxes in cash. Tax deductions in kind often underestimate the value of the inheritance, and the amount of the inheritance includes both movable and immovable property. This means that even if all the cash from the inherited property is used, it may not be enough to pay the estate tax. The heirs will then have to find ways to liquidate some of their assets to cover the tax. However, the price of the transaction is determined by who is more urgent and more confident. If Tony Stark is desperate to raise funds before the estate tax deadline, others will have room to lower the price. Alternatively, they could use their assets as collateral to borrow money from banks. However, even with collateral, such a large loan would inevitably require syndication from multiple banks, and if that's insufficient, they would resort to other financial institutions. This also gave others an opportunity to meddle in Stark Industries. It's safe to say that no one was mourning the death of a business magnate or a brilliant scientist, they simply wanted a piece of the action at this unexpected event. Audrey Hepburn wasn't particularly interested in the Stark family's affairs, they weren't close friends. But every guest she spoke to would chime in, and even if she didn't want to care, she'd know. But just because Audrey Hepburn had no close friends didn't mean her circle of friends was always so quiet. One evening, while at a hotel, Audrey Hepburn received a call from a friend. The frustrated voice on the other end of the line prompted him to ask, "Catherine, are you okay?" On the other end of the line was another Hepburn, Katharine Hepburn. He and Howard had known each other for decades. Although they had their share of disagreements and ultimately didn't end up together, they remained close friends who could confide in each other. Catherine sighed on the phone, "That's the downside of getting old. One day I hear someone's gone, the next day I hear someone's gone. It still breaks my heart, but I've gotten so used to it I can't even cry anymore. My condolences, Catherine. Is there anything I can do for you?" "Of course. Tomorrow is Howard's funeral, and I'll be in New York. Can I borrow your driver for a day?" Tony introduced us to him, and I thought it would be nice for him to come over and see him, regardless of whether we can finally talk. Audrey replied, "Of course. I think I'll go and pay my respects, too. After all, Mr. Stark has helped me a lot." "Catherine, when will you be in New York?" No one in Hollywood dared to claim to have absolutely no connection to Stark. "Actually, I'm about to leave to Bradley Airport. I might arrive late." "Okay, I'll have Henry make the arrangements," Audrey said. "Oh, it seems our driver is quite resourceful. You can trust him with everything," Catherine said, forcing herself to be cheerful, as if trying to dispel her sadness. Audrey agreed, "Yes, that kid's been a real help." He wanted to continue the conversation, but Catherine had a flight to catch. "So," he said, "let's talk in person. Otherwise, my flight will just keep getting later and later." "Okay, let's talk in person." After hanging up, Audrey Hepburn found her watch on her dressing table and gently pressed on a section of the metal strap. A moment later, there was a knock on the door. Henry said from outside, "Boss, you want to see me?" "The door's open. Come in." The women's room had an inner and outer room, with the outer room serving as a small living room. Henry, though not formally dressed, was neatly dressed. "Boss, what can I do for you?" "Catherine's flying into New York later. Could you please pick her up and arrange accommodations?" "We'll go to Mr. and Mrs. Stark's funeral tomorrow," Henry asked, surprised. "Did Catherine get an invitation?" "Do you need one?" Audrey asked. "I thought that kind of occasion would require invitations to limit the number of attendees. What if it was a funeral back home?" Henry could handle it from the 7th day to the 40th day. But he had no idea how things were done in the West. Audrey remained speechless at this common-sense question. After a moment's thought, she explained, "The invitation only notifies close friends of the time and location of the funeral. But even those who didn't receive an invitation and wish to attend can go. Don't you need to limit the number of attendees? Shaking her head, the woman said, if there are too many people, relatives or close friends will naturally maintain order. Besides, no one wants to cause trouble at such a sad occasion, and it's not appropriate. The concept of respecting the dead is universal, whether in the East or the West. It's normal for Henry to not know about something he hasn't encountered before. But what made him even more moved was Howard Stark's death. He offered sacrifices to the gods according to the path of Iron Man's achievement. Those familiar and unfamiliar people and events seem to gradually blend together. Chapter 134 Funeral. Howard Stark's funeral was held in Richford, central New York. This was his birthplace and the burial place of his parents, located in the town church cemetery. The Starks weren't quite enough to be called a family. Besides their small size and 3 generations of a single-line family, the only truly important members were Stark and his son. Now that the elder Stark had passed away, the younger Stark, while also recognized as a genius, was only in science. He had yet to prove himself in business. Few people actually received invitations to the Stark funeral, but many showed up uninvited. Acquaintances gathered in groups, mostly from the same field. This revealed the composition of the elder Stark's friends. The largest and most orderly group was military personnel. Their uniforms and medals clearly revealed their status. From colonels and up, they were filled with prominent generals, representing all 4 branches of the military, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. Killing these people would, if not cripple the U.S. military, at least severely injure it. Another group came from the cultural sector, primarily Hollywood figures and their accompanying journalists. Some of these people genuinely knew the elder Stark, while others were simply there to capitalize on the hype. But everyone was abiding by the rules, even the reporters, as quiet and well-behaved as kindergartners. Those who were too aggressive in interviews or stirring up trouble were taken away by the burly military men. With a general simple statement, this involves state secrets, those taken away could see the light of day forever. Who knows what state secrets were revealed at the funeral? They had the final say. Henry witnessed firsthand how a reporter from the British newspaper The Sun, dancing and dancing, was strangled and dragged away. Whether he made it back to England alive remains unknown. In the corporate world, a journalist's life carries less weight than one might imagine. With such a bloody example before them, others can't help but behave. If you want news, there's a press release, accompanied by official photos provided by Stark Industries. If you want to mess around, you'll have to pay the price, in every way. Henry, along with the 2 Hepburns, sat near the front of this Hollywood crowd. Besides her celebrity status, Katharine Hepburn's personal friendship with old Stark was well known, and no one dared to exclude him from the group. The most scattered group consisted of the leading figures in business and finance. Henry had seen many of them at Audrey Hepburn's fundraising event. They stood relatively spread out, yet like bees, they moved and buzzed constantly. They seemed to be plotting something, wary of one another. There was another, quite unique group, the smallest, yet with the most empty seats around them, as no one wanted to get too close. An elderly lady with shoulder-length silver hair led the group. Next to her stood a rather thin, white-haired old man. Behind them were mummies wrapped in bandages, and some were so tightly wrapped in coats that not even their faces were visible. Some of the men's limbs beneath their coats clearly didn't resemble those of a normal person, especially those furry tails and long, wolf-like snouts. So, they were the famous Howling Commandos. And the woman leading them was most likely Peggy Carter, considered Captain America's widow. She certainly didn't look anything like actress Hayley Atwell. Judging by his appearance, he was probably around the same age as Audrey Hepburn. But he was in much better shape, not as frail as Hepburn. What caught Henry's attention even more was the one-eyed man in the group. Dressed in a black coat, with brown hair and white temples, he was as burly as a bear. And the key point: he was white. This man, who looked like White Nick Fury, caught Henry's eye several times. Unexpectedly, this glance alerted the other man, who stared back. Sensing the other party's sharp gaze, Henry, like a young man with a clear yet foolish expression, looked back evasively, like a young man curious about the Howling Commandos' special status, yet embarrassed by being discovered. This action was, of course, a show. He just hoped it wouldn't draw the other party's attention. Whether the group was the Howling Commandos or SHIELD, intelligence organizations were always troublesome. The funeral mass was presided over by the priest of the small-town church. He probably didn't expect to preside over a funeral of the magnitude of the Starks, and therefore seemed a little overwhelmed. Fortunately, the imperfections were minor, and the entire ceremony went smoothly. In place of Tony Stark, who had disappeared somewhere, the person truly leading the funeral was Edwin Jarvis, the Stark family's butler and valet. The fact that he rushed through the crowd, forcing everyone to retreat like Moses parting the sea, showed just how high Edwin Jarvis's status was at the funeral. Even Obadiah Stane, Howard Stark's business partner and Stark Industries' second-largest shareholder, could only play second fiddle. Recognizing the old butler wasn't a matter of face recognition, of course. Jarvis personally approached and greeted Katharine Hepburn upon seeing her. Henry learned of her identity from their conversation. The circumstances beforehand were unclear, but since Henry's arrival, Katharine was the only one among the Hollywood crowd to receive such treatment. Others who appeared to be big bosses could only nod and greet from afar. With such a powerful figure, it's no wonder Katharine, regardless of her status, stood at the forefront of the Hollywood crowd. A host of bigwigs and directors played second fiddle. Audrey Hepburn and Henry simply benefited from the situation. In short, judging by the funeral's officiating, regardless of whether the bald Obadiah harbored any rebellious intentions at this stage, with the Stark's loyal butler still around, he couldn't possibly cause any trouble. When it came time to move the coffins to the burial, Howard Stark's coffin was carried in front, supported by 6 generals. They came from all branches of the military, their order determined by the number of stars they had. As for Maria Stark's coffin, the first bearer was the ever-unseen Tony Stark, the eldest son, wearing sunglasses. Then came the one-eyed man in white leather and a black coat, followed by Edwin Jarvis and Obadiah Stane. The last two were relatives or friends of the wife's side. Henry couldn't recognize them, nor did he overhear their names or identities from their conversation. However, those who could bear the coffin at such an event must be close and influential. Throughout the funeral, Henry shared the same sentiment as most others. It wasn't sentimental, but simply a desire to enjoy the spectacle. However, no one caused trouble at such an event, as there had been precedent. It wasn't that the Starks were overbearing, but that the U.S. military had intervened. Could there be a more rogue organization? Most people are probably wondering how they can profit from Howard Stark's death. Just like a whale's fall brings life to all creatures, a dead whale provides food for countless tiny marine creatures. This process can last for months, even years. So Howard Stark's death should be a good thing for everyone, except for his family. Even those who, judging by their micro-expressions, hormone secretions, and brain waves, are genuinely saddened, can't stop themselves from seeking profit. Of course, the death of a friend is sad, but one must take what is due, right? Chapter 135 Escape. The atmosphere at the Stark funeral was solemn and mournful. Nothing unexpected happened, at least not a few people claiming to be the elder Stark's illegitimate son and demanding a share of the estate. Katharine had actually wanted to speak to Tony, but the opportunity hadn't come. It wasn't that the future head of Stark Industries was surrounded by so many people that she couldn't get a table. It was that she couldn't even find him, and no matter who wanted to speak, there was no way. Young Master Tony was only seen when he was carrying his mother's coffin and during the final burial. Once the ceremony was over, he disappeared without a trace. Henry didn't deliberately use his super senses to look for him. After all, even if he did, he didn't know what he could do. Was he afraid that this young man, still in his rebellious phase, would blow up his parents' graves? Even if he did, it wasn't Henry's responsibility, it was their own family matter. Seeing no chance to talk, she began to tire. Having arrived in New York late the previous night and waking up incredibly early this morning, she'd been busy for quite some time, a strenuous task for an 80-year-old Katharine. So, Katharine found Jarvis, greeted him, and then left. Although he was eligible to attend the upcoming funeral, Audrey and Henry, who had accompanied him, weren't close enough to the Stark family. The funeral was only for family members and close friends, so Katharine simply left with Audrey. Henry couldn't say what kind of posthumous reputation Howard Stark would have. But the funeral dragged on into the afternoon. The sky darkened, and a light rain even began to fall, as if even the heavens were mourning the passing of the deceased. Henry, holding a large umbrella, walked behind the two Hepburn women, shielding them from the drizzle. They reached the car in the parking lot. After helping the two women to the car, Henry took off his suit jacket before getting in, gave it a gentle shake to clear the raindrops, and then climbed into the driver's seat. Unexpectedly, Just as he was seated, someone barged into the passenger seat. This car was a rental. Otherwise, Henry would have punched the person in the door. Drive. It was Tony Stark who sat in the passenger seat and buried himself in the seat. He spoke with a weak tone. It reminded people of the 2 flowers he held in his hands before the 2 coffins were covered with earth. 1 flower should have been placed on each coffin, but this young master seemed to have used up all his last bit of stubbornness and placed both flowers on his mother's coffin. This ungentlemanly behavior made those who were close to him and knew him well feel heartbroken. So even though he was almost invisible throughout the entire funeral ceremony, no one really blamed him. Because Tony Stark was the only one left in the Stark family. Now he suddenly appeared and ordered Henry to drive. The Kryptonian didn't know whether to be angry and drive him away, or to sympathize with him. Fortunately, his boss and his old friend made a decision. Catherine didn't care at all about the impact it would have if the only person in the bereaved family disappeared from the funeral. He simply patted Henry's shoulder from the back seat, as he sat in the driver's seat, and said, "Let's go. Let's find a place to eat." I thought I was full of anger after listening to all those hypocritical speeches today, but after it was over, I realized I'm still hungry. "Anything to eat?" Henry asked as he fastened his seatbelt. "You decide, kid. Just don't let me go hungry for too long. An old man can't stand that, okay? Everyone, fasten your seatbelts. We're off." Henry had deliberately chosen a car with seatbelts in the back seat, specifically for the safety of the 2 women. Although Henry was confident he wouldn't hit anyone while driving, sometimes you can't prevent or stop someone from hitting you, so you still have to take the necessary safety precautions. However, this reminder was primarily directed at the person in the passenger seat. But seeing that he looked like he was about to put his feet up on the dashboard, Henry gave up on telling the young man what to do. He turned the steering wheel, stepped on the accelerator, and the car drove away smoothly. Of course, no one noticed Tony Stark was in the car. Since someone had complained of being hungry, including Henry himself, he had no intention of driving all the way back to New York City to find a restaurant for his late lunch. Speeding was unacceptable. Not only was it dangerous, it would also result in a fine. As a law-abiding Kryptonian, Henry found a family-style restaurant on the road and stopped to eat. This wasn't the first family-style restaurant they'd come across, but one that Henry's super sense of smell suggested was likely good. No matter how hungry he was, Henry didn't want to use his palate if he could. Fortunately, his super sense of smell made trying new places much less risky. The 2 celebrities weren't the kind of pretentious people who wouldn't eat at a non-starred restaurant. As for Tony Stark, he was like The Walking Dead, getting out as everyone else got out. But Tony looked like he wanted to run, not eat. But with Catherine there, she grabbed the young man's arm and wouldn't let go, making it difficult for him to just walk away. It was already afternoon, past peak dining hours, so the restaurant was mostly empty. The group found a seat and a waitress arrived with a coffee pot, pouring hot coffee for each of them and presenting menus. "What would you like to eat?" Catherine asked. Her question was none other than the young master, who looked like he had lost all hope in life. Tony didn't refuse the food, but simply leaned his head against the large window and said weakly, "Cheeseburger." Catherine gestured for the waitress and said, "I'll have a peach cobbler." "And then a cheeseburger," Audrey continued, "apple pie, a steak, a spicy sausage, a honey muffin, fried chicken, fried bacon, 3 poached eggs, and an order of mashed potatoes." Henry's bold order frightened not only the waitress, but Catherine as well. Even Tony Stark, previously lost in his melancholy, gave him a look of disdain, Only Audrey seemed unfazed. Henry said without any guilt, "Why, I'm still growing, is that not okay?" Tony leaned back against the window with an even more hopeless expression, not wanting to say a word of complaint. The meal was served quickly. The 2 ladies were after dinner time, so they just wanted to fill their stomachs so they wouldn't be too hungry. They all picked up their forks, cut the pies and pastries into small pieces, and ate them slowly. Master Stark still looked like he had no appetite, and the hamburger was placed in front of him, but he didn't move. But Henry, with the meal spread all over the table, was not polite. He cut the food on the plate with his knife and fork quickly, as if making a noise on purpose, and then stuffed it into his mouth and chewed it all. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 136 The Angry Boys. Even though Henry was mindful of his manners, his rapid eating still made some noise. The constant chewing in particular irritated Tony Stark, causing him to roll his eyes. Infuriated beyond measure, Tony, as if in a fit of rage, also took a large bite of his burger. Then, smacking his food, he seemed to be competing with Henry for who could eat worse and louder. Normally, anyone displaying such poor dining etiquette in front of the two Hepburn ladies would likely be forced to put down their utensils and receive a lecture for over half an hour, if not a slap on the head. But today, the two ladies tacitly kept the matter to themselves, allowing the two boys to spar. However, no matter how fast Henry ate, he had a table full of food, while Tony only had a burger. So, before long, the young man had nothing in his hands. Regardless of what he was still eating, Tony picked up the untouched honey-drenched waffle and continued stuffing it into his mouth, smacking his food noisily. Seeing his muffin snatched away, Henry didn't snarl like a dog guarding its food. He simply raised his hand, beckoned the waitress back, and said, "Another helping of peach cobbler, apple pie, honey muffin, and a large order of fries." Even Audrey was startled. Her eyes widened as she stared at the young man beside her. Henry smiled shyly. "You guys seem to be enjoying your meal. I'm craving some too." As the food arrived, Henry continued to devour it swiftly. Tony, though much slower, continued to eat non-stop, relying solely on his hands, like a savage who'd been starving for days. Eventually, everything on the table was gone, and Henry, looking only about 70% full, picked his teeth. Tony Stark, overfed, slumped over his seat, sucking on his greasy fingers. Seeing Tony about to wipe his hands on his clothes, Catherine finally couldn't stand it anymore. He slapped Tony's hand and cursed, "You dirty bastard." Then he pulled a wet wipe from his purse and, like a wiping stick, cleaned each of Tony's fingers. He was like a doting grandmother. But instead of experiencing the tenderness, the grandson stared intently at a certain Kryptonian with his bulging eyes. Henry was convinced that if Tony Stark had the power of heat rays, he would have pierced him right now. But he didn't. So Henry contentedly enjoyed the gaze. They say that if you're not envied, you're mediocre. To be disliked by a genius must mean you've done something right. So Henry was quite pleased. After a moment, as if realizing his gaze wouldn't cut it against such a shameless person, Tony gave up his unblinking death stare. Rubbing his bloodshot eyes, he casually asked, "What do you think if I were to give up Stark Industries?" The two Hepburn ladies were shocked again. Before they could think of a good way to persuade him, Henry casually replied, "What do I think? It's pretty good. It just surprised me. It's a little different from what you did before." "How is it different?" Tanela asked in a high voice. Henry drank his coffee and called the waitress for another. Then he spoke slowly. "If old Mr. Stark were still alive, abandoning Stark Industries and starting from scratch would certainly be more difficult than joining Stark Industries. But now that old Mr. Stark has passed away unexpectedly, I don't know how well he prepared you to take over, but the situation is clear. You are surrounded by wolves and tigers. At this time, you said you wanted to abandon Stark Industries and start from scratch. I can only say that it is quite wise, isn't it? Because it is obvious that it is too difficult to save Stark Industries from the greed of a group of greedy bosses. Comparatively, abandoning Stark Industries, which is considered a target, and returning to your garage to start from scratch. In just another 70 years, you can create another Stark Industries. This outcome is almost inevitable. After all, if old Mr. Stark can do it, why can't you? It's as easy as pie, right? Oh, maybe old Mr. Stark has everything arranged. You just need to step forward, and like the heirs of the past, find a pope or a bishop to be crowned king. Then, if you succeed Stark Industries, people will say it's old Stark's legacy. Even a pig could accomplish the same. If you fail Stark Industries, people will surely say that young Stark is inferior to old Stark, and that the Stark family is declining. It's too difficult to silence everyone and make them acknowledge your strength and achievements. Instead of that, why not just throw everything away and start over? Would that be nice? Let's talk about social responsibility. I don't know the total number of employees at Stark Industries, but I'll assume 200,000. Assuming everyone is married with 2 children, then behind those 200,000 are 800,000 families. As someone with absolutely no experience, it's too difficult to suddenly shoulder the responsibility of supporting the livelihoods of 800,000 people. It's better to hand it over to a bank or some other interested entity. We all know how Wall Street handles these kinds of real estate assets. They basically pore over financial statements, cut off unprofitable departments, and then package the remaining assets and sell them off at triple or quadruple the price. So how many of the 200,000 employees will be left? Let's assume a 10% attrition rate. That means firing 20,000 people still leaves 180,000. Those who remain will have their salaries and jobs adjusted. Their final pay may be more or less than before. Let's assume another 10% is affected, making them even worse off. Then, if Stark Industries were to be harmed by Wall Street, only 30,000 to 40,000 people would suffer, and those who suffer would be the families of around 160,000. The livelihoods of over 100,000 people. What a heavy burden. It's better to just throw it all away and go back to the garage and do it yourself. After all, you're already feeding your family. Who cares about tens or even hundreds of thousands of people, right? So I believe your decision today wasn't based on difficulty, but simply a desire to distance yourself from Mr. Stark and his career. If you think about it that way, your attitude is consistent. Accusing you of acting differently is simply me being foolish, speaking without careful thought. It was my inconsiderateness, and I apologize. This flurry of words left Tony speechless. He could only pound the table, cursing, fuck, fuck, fuck. Chapter 137 Civilized Language. Seeing Tony determined to break the table, Henry quickly stopped him, saying, Hey, don't break it. You'll have to pay for it. If you're trying to start over from your garage, your bank account is your only source of funds. Trust me, you don't want to waste it on unnecessary compensation. The best approach is to not break anything. Tony Stark stopped pounding the table and pointed at Henry with his teeth bared. He made tiger claws with his hands, as if he wanted to strangle the other person. He stretched out his hands several times, and retracted them several times. Even the two Miss Hepburns on the side were stunned. They didn't know that it was possible to persuade people in this way. It's like someone is lying on the ground in frustration and doesn't want to get up at all. So someone takes a knife and stabs the other person desperately, until the other person jumps up in pain and can't lie on the ground anymore. Should I say it or not, it seems to be quite useful for Tony, this stubborn little brat. Tony Stark, who had been holding it in for a long time, finally gritted his teeth and said, Can't you speak less harshly? Why not? Henry looked at Tony Stark with resentment curiously, and said, I'm not your father, I don't need to educate you. I'm not your mother, I don't need to protect you. I'm not your brother, I don't need to cooperate with you. I'm not your wife yet, so I need to assist you. I'm not even your son or grandson, so I need to give you some respect. I'm especially not your employee yet, so I don't need to consider you as your boss. I don't know if we're even friends, we've only met a few times. But even if we're close, this is how I treat my friends. And I only tell the truth, never lie, so if you think my words are harsh, it's just because you're overly sensitive. You need to look for the problem within yourself, not others. Besides, what does it mean when you tell me you're giving up Stark Industries right when we meet? Do I have the final say in this matter? Or do I have the choice? To me, your behavior is like finding someone to blame for future mistakes. If you mess up, you can write in your memoirs, I was young and naive, and I actually trusted a small driver to make a decision, and then you accidentally reveal my name. Then your reputation will change from being stupid to blindly following others. That's still stupid, but it feels less foolish than if you had ruined Stark Industries yourself, and I'm just bad, the kind that everyone hates and everyone despises. I shouldn't be the rat on the street, everyone shouting and beating me, but who knows what I'll be like then. Henry hadn't experienced much in this life, but in his past, he'd encountered plenty of people like that. Regardless of the closeness of the relationship, when someone could shirk responsibility, they'd never let them off the hook. You, Tony Stark looked ready to bite again. He turned to the two women, as if seeking support. Can I pinch this pickled radish and not eat it? Catherine said nothing, slapping Tony on the back of the head. Use polite language. This scene frightened Henry, yet also secretly delighted him. This genius, whose future value would be worth at least tens of billions, was just as good at it. Truly worthy of the Queen of Hollywood, Katharine Hepburn. The nemesis of 2 generations of Stark. If someone like Thanos saw this, they'd be drooling with envy. Look at the future Iron Man's grandson with his neck shrunk. Katharine did what countless supervillains couldn't do, and she did it with just a slap. Although he didn't suffer a concussion, It must have left a psychological trauma. Henry also regretted not making some secret recorders or other equipment first. If this scene was saved, it would definitely be used to threaten Tony, and it would be a Black History material for his whole life. But Audrey Hepburn couldn't stand her assistant's bad taste. Although it sounds like this kind of provocative method is used to persuade people, Audrey guessed that Henry simply wanted to provoke people, and every word he said was meant to hurt people. He slapped Henry's arm and said with a little annoyance, "How can you talk like that? Shouldn't you think about how you can help Mr. Stark, Henry?" He rubbed his arm with a look of grievance. Henry said, "Boss, what advice can I give? I don't know about Mr. Stark's will, nor do I know the state of Stark Industries. Instead of asking me, why not find a gypsy girl and have her use a crystal ball to read the situation? Maybe her advice would be more constructive than mine. If Tony wants to ask, he should ask the people around Mr. Stark, they know the most." Of course, Henry wasn't trying to offer blind advice. As a seasoned keyboard warrior, when he wanted to criticize someone, he naturally chose to criticize where there wasn't much to criticize, lest it backfire. Since he didn't know the state of Stark Industries, if he offered random advice, it wouldn't be a problem if it turned out well. But if it went wrong, he'd be the one to take the blame. But this finally gave Tony an opportunity. He put on his usual condescending expression, his usual arrogance, and said, "Oh, so good at talking. I thought you could do anything. Turns out you can't do it." Henry didn't take it seriously and retorted, "Of course, I'm just a small assistant responsible for driving. I'm also an unknown passerby actor in Hollywood movies. It's normal that I can't manage a big enterprise or a big company." Henry was still not satisfied after just saying this. Pointing at Tony, he said to the two ladies, "Maybe we should just leave this guy with a confused mind and logical problems here. Let him go wherever he wants. I'm afraid that if I take him in the car, I'll listen to his nonsense all the way and end up becoming as stupid as him. That would be terrible." Catherine's hands were still faster than her mouth. She stretched out her hand and slapped away Henry's outstretched finger, saying, "You're rude. Since we brought him out, we have to take him away properly. So when we see an orphanage on the road, let's throw him out of the car. The old ladies in the orphanage will take good care of him. There's no need to leave any money. This kid is more valuable than us even if he has a hair plucked out. Wow, when it comes to stabbing, Grandma Catherine is the real deal. If she doesn't strike, it's fine, but once she does, she's got critical hits, defense penetration, and true damage." Tony's 3-second display of arrogance instantly shattered, and he cried out helplessly, "I'm 21, the legal drinking age. Not 2, another blow to the head," and Catherine glared, "Use polite language." Chapter 138, Inventory of Stark Industries. Around Christmas, a time when couples and families should gather, Stark Tower in New York City was anything but peaceful. The accounting, tax, and legal departments were ablaze, their employees working overtime. The heads and managers of Stark-owned properties across the country also gathered in New York, bearing their company's financial documents, to address the dramatic changes facing the group. A steady stream of condensed reports and detailed financial statements arrived at the chairman's office on the top floor. As the heir to Stark Industries, Tony Stark had been confined to this room for 3 days. With bloodshot eyes, he was ushered into the bathroom to clean himself up. If he didn't wash, he'd start to smell. Joining him in this battle were Howard Stark's most trusted and long-term business partner, Obadiah Stane, and the Stark family's butler, Edwin Jarvis. Both had families and other jobs, so they couldn't retreat into the chairman's office like Tony had. They had just returned from their respective homes to assist this young master. Finally, they'd gotten the seemingly insane young master to shower. Obadiah, bald as he sorted through the reports, was the first to speak up. "Did Tony take the wrong medicine? He couldn't be found on the day of the funeral, and I thought he'd run away again like before. Even if we could persuade him to come back, it would take a year or 2 before he'd reluctantly agree to inherit the company. I didn't expect him to be more enthusiastic than any of us now. Was he really taking the wrong medicine? Or has he been replaced by someone?" Edwin, who was tidying up the mess in the office, said, "Master Tony has come to his senses. Isn't that great? The inheritance tax payment deadline is 9 months, but it's actually very urgent. The sooner he gets on track, the more time we have." "That's true. But with all the rush now, I'm worried he might impulsively do something irrational." "Obadiah, do you think I'll do something irrational? Shut down all of Stark Industries?" Tony took a quick shower, changed into clean clothes and walked out. Obadiah was not at all embarrassed about being caught talking behind someone's back. He said bluntly, "Tony, you have to understand one thing. According to U.S. law, whether you want to shut down Stark Industries or do anything else, you must first pay off the inheritance tax before you have full legal power. If you can't think straight for a moment and destroy Stark Industries, and you can't pay the inheritance tax, then you won't achieve your dream of starting from scratch, but you will have to start with that. I really want to do this." Tony's simple words made the two old ministers of the Stark family nervous. "But it should be different from what you think." Obadiah, who felt like he had just ridden a roller coaster, felt that his heart was a little weak. He resisted the urge to faint and said, "Tony, you'd better tell me in detail. Don't scare your uncle to death." Picking up a few handwritten manuscripts from the table, Tony gestured to the guest sofa and said, "Obadiah, sit down. If you fall ill now, it will be very troublesome for me. Jarvis, whiskey, please." "Okay." Jarvis walked to the small bar and asked, "Mr. Stanley, do you need anything?" "Yes, I want a drink too." Tony sat down on the sofa, staring at what he had written in his hand, and said, "Jarvis, get yourself a drink too. Then sit down together. I have something I want to hear your ideas about." "Okay, young master." The old servant put 3 glasses on the silver tray, poured the wine, and brought it to the low table together with a bottle. Tony then began to speak. "I believe you all know Stark Industries' situation better than I do. While we have shareholders, we're not publicly listed, nor are we traded on the primary or secondary markets. I believe this is the biggest reason those Wall Street thugs are keeping a close eye on us." Obadiah said, "Yes, I've advised Howard on this matter. Although we have the military's support, in America, trying to monopolize a business doesn't end well." Stop. "I have a plan for this," he said, interrupting his uncle's lingering words. Tony knew that if he let him ramble on, he'd probably spend 3 days and 3 nights rambling on. "My point is, fortunately, we haven't entered the stock market, so our equity structure is relatively simple. Stark Industries should actually be called Stark Group, and you all own significant shares in certain companies, but there are 2 foundations involved, the New York City Veterans Foundation and the Stark Education and Culture Promotion Foundation. What do these 2 foundations do? In many companies, these 2 foundations hold a significant percentage of shares. The latter is found in almost every company under the group, while the former is found in almost all companies with particularly impressive financial reports." Edwin Jarvis replied, "Master, the Stark Education and Cultural Promotion Foundation was established by Master, imitating Jewish practices to avoid the hefty inheritance tax. You have always been the registered director of this foundation. However, there are annual restrictions on the transfer of property. Although Master has been doing this, he still has a large amount of property registered in his name. Then what about the New York City Veterans Foundation? How is it related to the Veterans Association? The latter is an official U.S. organization, while the former is a white glove of the Strategic Homeland Defense Attack and Logistics Agency." Jarvis couldn't explain this point because it was confidential. He thought for a moment and could only say, "The Veterans Foundation is different from the Veterans Association. It is a private organization. The head has always been Miss Peggy Carter, who is considered Captain America's widow. However, he has recently been looking for a successor and plans to retire." It's Auntie. Tony shuddered. Another woman he couldn't afford to offend. But considering the old man's camaraderie with those men, anything he might do wasn't surprising. There might even be military influence behind the scenes, so Tony didn't intend to pursue that portion of his equity. He simply sought their support. "So, based on the results of these days of overtime work and the audited amount, I'll have to contribute a total of $3.4 billion to the U.S. government, not counting the fraction. Is that the correct amount?" "It's several times more than the entire group's total liquidity." Obadiah, however, seemed to be gloating. "That's because we don't have to disclose our financial statements, so the outside world can't be sure of Stark Industries' situation. Otherwise, according to those newspaper reports, you'd be paying an astronomical inheritance tax of hundreds of billions." Chapter 139 Transformation Plan. Let those guys eat shit. Tony had no fondness for reporters, only for the beautiful ones. But that only applied to the reporters themselves. As for the reports, he'd never linked a particular report to a particular beautiful woman. Tony then said with a hint of disdain, "I think the old man's biggest problem is that he wants to do everything, has a little bit of everything, and yet he's not very good at anything. Of course, by not very good, I don't mean that the products aren't good enough, but that the products aren't competitive enough in the market. That has to do with us being involved in so many industries, and the marketing and PR department isn't able to effectively leverage them. Singling out the marketing and PR department was practically like blaming Obadiah Stane. After all, the division of labor between him and Old Stark was Howard in charge of research, and him in charge of marketing. So, the bald Obadiah said with dissatisfaction, discussing this won't solve your predicament, Tony. This is the mess your father left behind. We can figure out how to fix it later. But right now, we have to figure out how to squeeze out the taxes you're supposed to pay. This is what I'm talking about. I plan to streamline Stark Industries' structure and sell some industries. That is, to adjust the strategic layout and develop in a more targeted manner, rather than making decisions based on my mood. At the same time, Tony handed over a piece of paper in his hand and said, "This is the industry I plan to sell." Seeing that the document included the Texas oil fields under the name of Stark Industries, overseas minerals, and some industries that could be regarded as cash cows. Both Obadiah and Jarvis felt that this was a prodigal son, and said with pain, "Tony, are you serious? These are profitable industries. You say you will sell them." Tony Stark said, "Only things that can make money can be sold at a high price. If anyone wants to lower the price, we will find other buyers. Those industries that lose money will be despised even if they are given as toilet paper. How much money can we expect to get in exchange? But this is not a reason to waste them," Obadiah said distressedly. "The old one is unreliable, and the young one is not reliable either. This damn father and son." Tony put out 2 more sheets of paper and said, "This one records the companies that I think it is necessary to keep, but need to be adjusted or merged. As for this one, it is the company that we have to find a way to sell or lay off. We can transfer employees to other units that are short of staff or preparing for expansion, but they can also choose to leave after receiving a generous severance pay. We will not force them on this part." Both lists were densely written, even on the front and back. Neither Obadiah nor Jarvis could make sense of it for a moment. Tony continued, "I also plan to list all of my companies that are eligible. That includes those that are up for sale, Master," Jarvis said. "While a stock market listing is good for raising capital, it's not conducive to control. That's why Master has always rejected Wall Street, I understand. But we can use the public market to divest some of our cumbersome companies and cash out. We just need to firmly grasp our future development priorities." Hearing this juxtaposition, Obadiah leaned forward and asked, "What are our future development priorities?" Tony placed the last piece of paper on the table and explained, "Stark Industries' most powerful ally has always been the U.S. military. But I don't believe they were reliable. If we can't provide what the military needs, they won't hesitate to turn to others, so I think this supporter shouldn't be easily abandoned. In my vision, Stark Industries' future development will focus on military-related industries. Manufacturing of consumer products, as long as they're related to the military, will be reduced to a manufacturing division, integrated into the main industry. Then, the marketing department will be eliminated and the R&D department will be merged. Anything unrelated will be sold to someone willing to take over. If no one wants to take over, just keep it going, and no longer prioritize development support. This way, the seeded market share should confuse and satisfy most of its competitors. What we need to do is, before others react, build an impenetrable wall around the key areas we control, preventing them from interfering. Focus our efforts on key development. Don't worry about the rest of the petty gains." After hearing Tony's explanation, Obadiah and Jarvis reviewed the 4 lists he presented and realized the true value of them. This young master had truly understood Stark Industries' current situation before making these lists and judgments. He hadn't made these decisions impulsively. Obadiah, in particular, had had enough of the elder Stark's haphazard approach. Following that brilliant genius, constantly radiating brilliant ideas, was exhausting for him, a mere mortal. Jarvis, however, considered another issue and said, "In this case, it's extremely urgent to get everything done within 9 months. Before the estate tax payment deadline." "No," Tony said, "we shouldn't have to wait until the entire plan is complete before we can raise enough money to solve the estate tax problem. But Stark Industries' transformation won't stop there. Are you considering retaining equity in those key industries, avoiding entering the public market and introducing too many shareholders to avoid losing control?" Jarvis asked. Tony shook his head and said, "Today we're going to disrupt the situation, making it difficult for others to see our true intentions and avoid being targeted. Furthermore, for those military industries that we plan to retain and develop, the issued shares can be dispersed to win over key figures and tie them to our chariot. This way, things will be more foolproof. This part, you'll have to rely heavily on your uncle. Once the group's restructuring is complete, your shares will be converted into group stock. I believe this compensation is quite good. Jarvis was fine with this, but for Obadiah, it was like a shot of chicken blood, his face flushed with excitement. Alright, I'll find people I trust and assemble a strategic team right now. I'll have a draft plan for you in a few days. Tony nodded, turned to his old butler, and said, Jarvis, the phone, please. Jarvis immediately stood up and pulled the phone from his desk to the reception table. At the same time, he asked, Master, do you need me to contact someone? No, I'll call an old classmate. He dialed the number himself, and soon heard the other party's greeting answer the phone. Tony said cheerfully, Hey, Rode, this is Tony. I called you because I want you to come and help me with some work. Don't keep counting on the front lines. Back in the British Empire, that was called letters of marque. In modern times, it's called overseas garrisons. It's all about killing, burning, and looting. No, I'm not asking you to leave the army. I want you to be Stark Industries' liaison within the military. If the US military can't send a blonde with a nice ass, I'd at least like someone I know. What? Watch the news? What's so good about the news? Okay, let me see. Tony gestured for Jarvis to turn on the TV on the low cabinet in his office. CNN was reporting a breaking news story about the disintegration of the Red Empire. Even Tony Stark, whose father had just died unexpectedly and whose funeral had just ended, was so shocked by the report that he didn't know what to say. Obadiah, and Jarvis looked at each other. They all had the same thought, what a stroke of luck. Chapter 140 The Essence of Social Banquets. News of Howard Stark's funeral dominated the news for days, with talk shows, newspapers, and television all featuring the topic. It seemed as if the story would last until next year. But in reality, a few days later, another, even bigger and more significant international news item quickly replaced Howard Stark's death, dominating the headlines. On December 25, 1991, the president of the Red Empire announced his resignation. The following day, the 26th, the Red Empire collapsed. Any player capable of participating in this imperial collapse was eager to exploit the interests of those who had lost control. Until the vestiges of domestic order within the empire were re-established, it would be a frenzy for capital. In comparison, Stark Industries' size became a mere chicken ribs. It was tasteless to eat, but a pity to discard it. Those qualified to meddle in Stark Industries suddenly found a larger, easier-to-eat pie nearby. Even those without the qualifications found opportunities to profit from the nearby pie. Naturally, everyone's attention shifted from Stark Industries to the dismantling of the Red Empire. News about Stark Industries seemed to have fallen silent, vanishing from the newspapers and media without a trace. Even if Henry wanted to care, he had no way of knowing the actual situation. What made Henry curious was what would have happened to Stark Industries if the Red Empire hadn't acted as a shield. However, such hypothetical questions were meaningless. Those who wanted to use Howard Stark's death to target Stark Industries would probably cry in the bathroom. Who knew that the Red Empire was so incompetent that the top management was fooled into disbanding voluntarily? No one could give up the lucrative Red Empire and continue to target Stark Industries. Henry had originally thought that with these two major events, the fundraising party initiated by Audrey Hepburn would have quieted down a bit. Who knew it would have become even more lively? One night, while driving back to his hotel after a banquet, Robert Wards complained about this in the car. Hey, these partygoers are really going crazy lately, constantly talking about the Red Empire, he said. And they're also discussing how to profit from it. Everyone was testing the waters, asking about who would be interested in participating, their own strengths, the other side's weaknesses, the potential profits, and the risks. Robert's main target of these complaints was certainly not Audrey Hepburn. Although the retired actress did not reject such topics, she also did not like to talk behind other people's backs. The only one who could complain with Robert was Henry, who was sitting in the driver's seat. Robert liked banquets, and he liked the feeling of moving among important people, as if he was an important person like them. If there's anything that can be compared with this feeling, it is showing off in front of others. So the new assistant became a good listener, and Henry was also very interested in these things. The reason for Henry's interest was not that he wanted to be like Robert, to participate in it, and eventually become a member of this class. He just regarded it as watching a reality movie, to see the lifestyle of these rich people and broaden his horizons. People who enjoy watching the show, this attitude has never changed. So after hearing Robert's complaints, Henry followed the meaning of the words and said, "Yes, I think their behavior is really exaggerated. I almost thought this was some kind of pre-war mobilization, not a fundraising banquet for the Children's Fund." Henry, don't be surprised. This is the original purpose of social banquets. Oh, aren't these banquets just for a bunch of bored and rich bigwigs to gather together to eat, drink, chat and gossip? Haha. As you said, they make hundreds of thousands of dollars a minute, so why would they waste time on meaningless things? Even the women from upper-class families don't just dress up beautifully and show off their feathers like peacocks. It's all just superficial. Oh, Robert, tell me. Let me broaden my horizons. Having an audience is more exciting than anything else. Audrey Hepburn, who was in the car with them, couldn't stop the two excited boys, so she could only serve as a background. Robert said excitedly, "To put it bluntly, every public banquet is the best opportunity for these bigwigs to collude, connect and communicate. Because the theme of the banquet serves as a cover, it conceals their private purposes. Plus, with so many people at a banquet, it's easy to recruit others to join in the fun. Even those with a little extra cash will use this opportunity to look for suitable business opportunities. On the other hand, if every matter has to be discussed in a centralized meeting, the media will easily reveal the purpose just by looking at the attendees, which will actually hinder progress. Even the women may be acting as messengers, brokers, and other such tasks, conveying messages between people who are not comfortable standing together. Women who want to drag wealthy men into a small room when they see them are just decorative vases at banquets like this. They're not even capable of serving as a microphone, so they're not worth mentioning at all." Henry looked at the silent Ms. Hepburn and asked, "Boss, do you know about this? I see you're just warmly welcoming every guest and constantly persuading them to donate to UNICEF. Should we change our conversational tactics?" This experienced lady was not some naive fool. With a wise smile, she said, "Child, of course I know what the real purpose of those people attending the banquet is. I even know what the meaning of the questions they asked when I talked to them is. If I want, I can easily become a broker and introduce people with similar goals to each other. But I don't need to do that, and it's not appropriate. Anyway, our main purpose is to raise funds for the Children's Fund. No matter what the purpose of those people coming is, they can't say nothing. At least they will provide an admission ticket, right?" Henry thought about it and said with relief, "Yes, there are many people who will report to almost every banquet. Those who don't know would think they love children so much. But when you look at the amount they donated, it's just a decent number." Simply put, Audrey Hepburn meant that everyone gets what they need. After all, it won't interfere with each other, and the other party is not plotting a crime, so why not turn a blind eye? Many things are like this. If you think about it, it won't be a big deal. There is no conflict of interest with you anyway, so why bother with it? The daily fun of fun people +1. Facts have proved that rich people have more tricks. Chapter 141 Busy Visit Schedule. Of course, fundraising banquets can't be held indefinitely. The money raised must be spent. So, after the New Year holiday, UNICEF's aid activities resumed. With Henry helping with the chores, Audrey Hepburn, with an energy that astonished many young people, continuously promoted visits to Africa, South Asia, Central America, and South America, and even participated in them personally. This was because UNICEF had a large number of project staff, so they could organize and plan the activities in batches. Otherwise, they would have been overwhelmed by Ms. Hepburn, who only needed to attend and give reports afterward. In particular, every African country they visited was accompanied by UN peacekeeping troops. This inevitably had some impact on the local situation. Other countries didn't have this privilege. Managing this influence became a major concern for UN members concerned with African affairs. The number of peacekeeping troops was not unlimited, and the UN couldn't possibly deploy a large number of them to maintain order in Africa. Some even argued that a little chaos in this dark continent was better for the entire Western world. The Islamic world was already at loggerheads. If the blacks rose again, Europe would be doomed to be attacked from both sides. But the key was to maintain a certain level of chaos, not to let it get out of control. If a place was too peaceful, it would be necessary for them to stir up chaos. Therefore, Audrey Hepburn's child care efforts also harbored nefarious political agendas. UN personnel had let slip more than once to Henry and Ms. Hepburn, but for the time being, everyone brushed it off. During their evening break, Henry couldn't help but ask Audrey Hepburn, who was reviewing a draft report. "Boss, is it normal for UN personnel to mess around like this?" he asked. "I'm surprised you'd be so upset about something like that." During their time together, Audrey Hepburn knew her assistant wasn't particularly interested in public service, and certainly didn't care about the underlying grievances. Henry said honestly, "I'm just curious about your thoughts. Do you think I'm Mother Teresa?" Audrey Hepburn smiled meaningfully and said, "I knew Mother Teresa and was a good friend, but I can't be like him." You can't expect a woman who's seen Hollywood to be like a saint, with no tolerance for even a speck of dust in her eyes. "At least these children are being helped, right?" Henry asked. "So as long as the end result is good, even minor flaws along the way are okay," Audrey Hepburn said helplessly. "You can't expect everyone participating in charity events to be saints, bring their own food, and participate for free, but you don't receive any compensation for these activities, and sometimes even contribute additional aid supplies out of your own pocket," Henry said. "But my travel expenses, including food and accommodation, and those of other participants, are all covered by UNICEF. Even you enjoy the same public travel benefits." Ms. Hepburn spoke the truth. Looking at Henry, who looked troubled, she added, "We hope to use all the funds raised for the children. That would be the best outcome, of course. But you have to understand that our purpose here is not just to provide aid. A few days ago, local warlords were harassing us. But after the peacekeeping troops arrived, the harassment subsided temporarily. This is what we brought, in addition to supplies and medical assistance. We also brought a brief peace. It's a bit disheartening, but isn't this brief peace precious? I know I can't save the world, and I'm aware that those who came with us probably have other missions. But at least we saved the children right here. Even if it seems like a false hope, and some accuse us of hypocrisy, perhaps this brief peace is a chance for one child to change their future, even if most people ultimately return to their old ways." This is what Emperor Xiaoli of Shu Han meant when he entrusted his son to the care of his father in Beatty City. Don't let a kindness go unappreciated, even if it's small. Henry, understanding this, also understood why he was willing to follow Ms. Hepburn in these charitable activities. Of course, this wasn't about coveting someone's 60-year-old body. Perhaps initially, she was drawn to his star power, but now, she was still willingly driven by it, simply out of admiration and respect. While she had no desire to be like him, it didn't stop her from admiring his ability to accomplish something she couldn't. After a moment's thought, Ms. Hepburn added, "That being said, it would still be disappointing if none of the money raised went to the children, or perhaps they were making demands that needed to be met before help could be given. That wouldn't be an act of goodwill, but a transaction. It's just that everyone has their own idea of where to draw the line. For me, even if the money isn't used for aid, it should at least be spent on saving children. Simply put, those who do things are human, not saints who don't need food or drink." Striking the right balance is a difficult question with no right answer. This is also why superheroes are so great. They're each like the hard-working person in the story of Buddha cutting flesh to feed the eagle. Henry acknowledged that helping others was a noble act of kindness. However, he was only willing to help when he could, not at the expense of himself. For someone as naive as a cow and horse, a master of all pool tactics, Henry felt his Kryptonian ability lay in his ability to shrug off the burden. If you lie flat enough, wind resistance is low, it's common sense, without so much suffering, life would be joyful. Therefore, he only wanted to do things that brought him joy, rather than struggling to follow endless desires set by others. That was no different from a donkey chasing a carrot dangling in front of its face. He was just a Kryptonian donkey. Reaffirming his principle of living a carefree life, Henry got busy again. This string of words seemed magical, but it was like a bootlicker who puts on two different faces in front of his buddies and his goddess. He said no, but his body remained obedient. At least Henry felt he was doing what made him happy. Helping Audrey Hepburn made him happy. If the lady said to him, "Let's destroy the Earth," Henry would definitely smile and blow the Earth up with one punch. Who cares if this is the Marvel Universe or if the Celestials are cats hatching eggs in the center of the Earth? If the Earth is not blown up, the only possibility is that it cannot be done. After all, to this day, Henry still has no evidence to prove that he is really a Kryptonian, let alone a Kryptonian on par with Superman. So, I wonder if the escape pod that he took to the Earth was dismantled by the Russians? According to the Russians' nature of doing things, Henry doubts that he can find even a screw when he goes back. Thanks to giant cloud whale, book friend 20,240,813,869 ek, and woodpecker 704 for the reward. Chapter 142 Forced Vacation. When the final UNICEF presentation concluded, both Audrey Hepburn and Henry breathed a sigh of relief. Since resuming their UNICEF visits at the end of January, they'd been busy for over 3 months without a break. Finally, as May arrived, Ms. Hepburn took a mandatory 2-week leave. The reason was simple: the peacekeeping force deployment was already fully loaded, unable to deploy additional personnel to support the operation. Unless the UN sent in additional troops, even for UNICEF activities alone, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council wouldn't approve it. The question was, where would the funds come from? The peacekeeping force deployments were entirely subsidized by the UN, not UNICEF. The UN doesn't print its own funds, it receives dues from member states. Even if it's interspersed with visits to other regions, the same cannot be said. Any troop deployment is no small matter. As a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, Ms. Hepburn's active presence was certainly a positive development. With her as a leader, smaller initiatives could be facilitated. But there's always a limit, and so Ms. Hepburn was forced to take leave. 2 weeks of rest couldn't be more, not less. Should he stay in New York and continue hosting fundraisers to fleece the wealthy? Or return to Switzerland for a truly restful 2 weeks? The answer to this question was obvious. So, Henry was on a plane, accompanying Audrey Hepburn in first class. The cost of the flight was, of course, her own, not government-funded. The service in first class was exceptional, and the stewardesses and flight attendants were incredibly attentive. Henry didn't mind being busy, his super speed gave him more time to get things done than others. But when he could relax and rest, he didn't skimp. Perhaps, with his super speed, wasting time wasn't a luxury, but rather a precious commodity. So, he relished the leisurely time on the plane. A direct flight from New York to Switzerland takes about 7.5 to 8 hours. Henry mostly spent this time reading a book, savoring it quietly and attentively. Sometimes, he'd scribble in his notebook, jotting down ideas for ways to enhance Linux's functionality. Aside from lacking the free time to engage with others online, Henry had become a prominent figure among his co-developers. Using the username CK given his vision of the future, it would be easy for him to forcefully seize control of Linux development. Even the bona fide leader, Linus Torvalds, had offered a partnership on the Joker BBS. However, Henry remained cautious. Just like in the water margin, not everyone became a bandit just to wait for a chance to be recruited. Today, on the plane, he was reading the first edition of the 4th volume of War and Peace, originally in Russian. It covered Moscow after Napoleon's invasion. The content, however, wasn't entirely storytelling, but rather contained more philosophical discussions. The book even bore Tolstoy's autograph. It was part of the personal collection of Audrey Hepburn, a fellow reader. He owned a complete set of signed first editions. Such precious antiques should ideally be preserved in a suitable environment. However, Audrey Hepburn believed that books were meant to be read. So, instead of blocking Henry's request to borrow it, he encouraged him. Partly because he couldn't read the Russian version, he felt a sense of guilt for the book. Henry didn't have a time machine to look back at the origins of Western philosophy, or whether it was a fabrication. At least the ideas described in it were genuine. He'd been meaning to review the thoughts of the ancient philosophers of the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period, to see if his current superhuman brain could yield some new insights. But finding suitable books wasn't easy, so Henry had to put those matters aside. Just as he was pondering the implications of Pierre's vapid complaints about the war in occupied Moscow, a small commotion spread across the plane, quickly spreading to first class. Everyone leaned out the side windows. Above the clouds, the plane was closer to the outer atmosphere than the ground itself. A sky previously filled with nothing but stars, besides the moon, presented a unique spectacle today. A ball of orange fire floated in the sky. Tentacles of flame extended outward from time to time, their shapes shifting in an unpredictable pattern. Is that the aurora? That's not the aurora. The aurora within the Arctic Circle has a sense of orderly beauty. That thing is just as beautiful, but it doesn't have the same geometric beauty. So what is that? I don't know. Look, it's changing. Henry naturally overheard the passengers' discussion on the plane. Even Ms. Hepburn, who was also reading, noticed and looked out the small round window of the plane. Henry, The woman called to the Kryptonian, also reading, and asked, "What do you think that is in the sky?" Looking out another window, Henry felt that the scene was familiar, but it was hard to connect it with any major event in his mind. However, most cosmic radiation is blocked by the Earth's ozone layer. And judging by the object's changing trajectory, it didn't seem to be approaching Earth, so Henry didn't delve into it. He answered honestly, "Boss, I don't know what that is either." "You don't know either? That's really rare," Audrey Hepburn said, looking at Henry and smiling. Henry threw up his hands helplessly and said, "The more you know, the more you realize your own ignorance. This is a common sentiment shared by many academic veterans." "Can you take a picture?" the woman asked. Henry immediately stood up, retrieved his camera from the overhead bin, and switched to a suitable lens. Although Ms. Hepburn's photography skills weren't particularly good, he was willing to give it a try. Even Henry's own skills were based on his own research, based on a few books, so he had no right to belittle anyone. But in this situation, Henry handed the camera to the woman and explained some aperture and shutter speed settings for night photography. He himself covered the window tightly with a large blanket, leaving only the lens against the tempered glass. When shooting through glass like this, the biggest concern is glare and reflections. So we have to block out any extraneous light sources to capture something. After taking a test shot, the woman fine-tuned the settings according to her own understanding and took a few more. The results would only be revealed after she returned home and developed the photos. So he handed the camera back to Henry, and used his eyes and brain to memorize this amazing scene. Henry, on the other hand, used his supervision to notice that a space shuttle had unfortunately approached the strange energy mass in the sky. Then, as if captured, it lost power and hovered nearby. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 143, Space Shuttle Endeavour Accident. Should we rescue a powerless space shuttle? How could we? Not setting off fireworks was already a gesture of great conscience. As long as that thing didn't burn the plane, Henry would have nothing better to do than show off. Resigned to his seat, Henry continued flipping through his literary masterpiece. Even the other people on the plane, constantly looking at this kind of scenery, got used to it. Those with cameras snapped a few photos, then went about their business. The plane landed safely at Geneva International Airport in Switzerland. The driver of the pre-booked airport transfer was already waiting in the departure hall, holding a sign. The two of them calmly returned to Hepburn's home in Trojana, Switzerland. It was an 18th-century farmhouse, 2 stories with a small attic, a very simple old house. It had an orchard, a vegetable and flower garden, and a lush lawn, all maintained by Hepburn herself. However, in recent years, she'd been busy with UN activities and had neglected it. Although Robert Wards also lived here, he wasn't as meticulous about the grounds as Ms. Hepburn. He preferred walking his dogs, taking their 5 Jack Russell Terriers for a jog, a grand spectacle. Missy, Toby, Penny, Pissery, and Jackie. This was Ms. Hepburn's 50th birthday gift to Robert. Besides these 2, a maid came daily to clean the house. Ms. Hepburn's children, now grown, only occasionally returned to see their mother. Henry was the 3rd semi-permanent resident, occupying a guest room. He had originally planned to rent a house in town, but Ms. Hepburn's farm was large enough that she simply allocated a room for him. Henry's work was with Ms. Hepburn anyway, so living closer made communication easier and made it easier to call in for any last-minute chores. It felt quite like the long-term workers of a wealthy family in the old days. There was no iron gate at the entrance to the farm, only a hedge and stone arch separated the inside and outside. So the driver easily drove in. The familiar barking of dogs brightened Audrey Hepburn's mood, unlike someone who had just gotten off a long-haul flight. Henry got out first, opened the door for the woman, and helped her out before collecting her luggage. Then, 5 brown and white dogs, tails wagging wildly, came running, vying for attention, nearly drowning out Hepburn's frail frame. Audrey Hepburn, well aware of her own dog's habits, prepared herself for their enthusiastic welcome. She petted them left and right, meticulously giving them every possible pat, no favoritism. "You're back," Robert Wards greeted her at the front door, giving Hepburn a big hug and welcoming her home. The abandoned dogs lined up pitifully in front of Henry, their tongues lolling and their tails wagging. Henry, not particularly fond of animals, petted the dogs' heads twice as a greeting and then carried the luggage inside. The unsatisfied Jack Russell Terrier wagged its tail and dodged between Henry's feet, trying to get him to enter. Ms. Hepburn, who had sauntered in, was telling Robert about the amazing sight he'd seen from the plane. "You know, we saw this really strange ball of fire from the plane, higher up above the clouds. It was really beautiful, but I thought it was a little eerie. We took some pictures, though I don't know how they turned out. I'll have Henry develop them, and you'll see." I know what you're talking about," Robert said. "It was on the news last night. The report said NASA announced that the fire in the sky was a solar flare approaching Earth. Unfortunately, the Space Shuttle Endeavour was severely damaged by a solar flare during its first space mission, STS-49. We don't know what's next, or whether any rescue efforts have been launched," Audrey Hepburn, a touch nervous, said. "Really? I hope they're all okay and rescued," Robert comforted his close friend, saying, "Don't worry. Even if NASA can't handle it on its own, we still have the X-Men. Mutants have many and strange abilities, so they'll always be useful." Robert Ward's words were one of the reasons Henry felt he had trouble fitting into this world. Everyone seemed accustomed to mutants, wary of them and prone to throwing problems at them. It was a bit different from their reliance on superheroes. When trouble arose, the mutants were left to deal with it. Otherwise, the source of the trouble was always determined to be the mutants' fault. Henry's appearance made it easy for him to blend in with the crowd, so he certainly didn't think of seeking trouble. And what about that thing in the sky being called a solar flare? And not a single astrophysicist objected. It was obvious there was something fishy going on. Even if a cloud of gas carrying a solar flare from the sun's surface approached Earth, it wouldn't linger or persist for long. Furthermore, a flare of that magnitude approaching Earth would unleash enough electromagnetic waves and ion storms to cause damage to the surface. It wouldn't just harm a passing space shuttle. Never mind. It's none of my business, so I'll just ignore it. Henry contentedly went about his business. There were bags to pack and clothes to wash. When the evening news came around, Robert was sitting in the living room, petting the dog and watching the news. Henry, along with Ms. Hepburn, was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. It wasn't a matter of Henry being a sycophant or Robert being overly chauvinistic. It was simply that Ms. Hepburn could prepare dinner quickly by herself when they were just two. But Henry could eat enough for 3 or 4 people, so preparing it all by herself would be like preparing a feast every night, potentially starting at noon. So Henry decided to join in the effort. Both Audrey and Robert were happy to order more dishes and try different flavors. Even if they only took a bite of a dish, Henry would finish the rest. As long as there was no waste, no one cared about how much food was prepared. However, Robert, who was watching the news, suddenly exclaimed, "Huh, just as I thought, what's wrong?" Audrey asked in the kitchen. Robert, still sitting in the living room, said loudly, "Last night, when the Endeavour space shuttle malfunctioned, the President of the United States dispatched the X-Men, who successfully rescued all the astronauts. Professor X was also commended and awarded a medal afterward. It's on the news." "Oh, is everyone okay?" Audrey asked in the kitchen. "It didn't say that on the news. I'm afraid they're still checking or it's not serious. If there were any casualties, they would have said that long ago. But they did say that the solar flare crisis has been resolved." Henry remained silent the entire time, simply pondering the familiarity. Solar flares, X-Men, could this be the movie Dark Phoenix? That movie, in which the heroes are neither heroes nor wise men, and the aliens are neither aliens, was criticized as a movie in which all the characters are sick. Chapter 144 Seeking Help. Even if you don't seek trouble, it will find you. Henry, squatting and tending the flower bed, was splashed with dirt by a dog's digging. Audrey Hepburn laughed maliciously, making no effort to stop her dog's actions. Henry was thinking of how to describe the deliciousness of the dog meat hot pot in French. "Tonight, I'll convince the 2 old people to have some nourishing food. If they need any Chinese herbs, I'll fly out and buy them." Just as he was about to send a blast of heat towards the dog's raised butt, the maid inside, cleaning, called out in French, "Henry, there's a call for you." "Call? Who's calling?" Henry asked. Because no one would call Ms. Hepburn's house specifically for him, they usually called Robert or directly to her. The maid said, "I don't know who it is. He keeps speaking English, and I don't understand. I only hear Henry, Henry. You don't speak English, so come and listen. Those who speak English as an international language should visit Europe. The chances of encountering setbacks are high." But now wasn't the time to complain. Henry quickly stood up, dusted himself off, and said, "I'll be right there." Perhaps the other party wanted to ask me, his assistant, to arrange the lady's itinerary. This was a common occurrence in New York. Those who wanted to invite Audrey Hepburn would usually check with him first to confirm the lady's schedule before making the invitation. So, after nodding to the lady still tending the flower garden, Henry trotted into the house and answered the phone. He said in English, "This is Henry. Where can I find you?" A female voice came over the line, saying, "This is Raven. Mystique from the X-Men." Click. Henry hung up as quickly as he could without damaging the phone. Audrey Hepburn, who had entered a little later and was removing her gardening gloves, asked, "Henry, who is this?" "Wrong number," Henry had just replied when the phone rang again. Ms. Hepburn gave him a reproachful look, clearly sensing that this was more than just a wrong number. Henry could only answer the phone again, feeling frustrated. Before he could even get close to his ear, he heard the person on the other end yell, "Mad fake, you damned alien. If you hang up on me again, I'll..." Click. Henry hung up again with the same lightning speed. Unsure if Ms. Hepburn had heard the call clearly, Henry simply made a face and said, "The person on the other end is a bit pissed off. Let's wait until they calm down." "Well, I don't think you'll be able to calm them down if you keep hanging up on them like that," Ms. Hepburn said fairly. But he was also certain the call wasn't about official business. Otherwise, the assistant wouldn't have been so rude. Then the phone rang again. Henry stared at the ringing phone with disgust, debating whether to smash it with a punch. Audrey Hepburn, however, looked on in amusement, glancing at the phone and winking at Henry. Henry, having no choice but to answer the phone, spoke up, "Calm down, or I'll hang up again." "I'm calm now, too damn calm. To think I'd fly to Switzerland and beat you to death right now." "Calm down, Mom. I thought our little misunderstanding was settled a while ago. The best way to get along is to have no contact. Now you're calling my boss's house, and that really puts me in a difficult position." Audrey Hepburn's mouth twisted into a circle, a look of sudden realization on her face. She didn't think this was some kind of romantic bet, did she? Okay. His words were certainly misleading. But it was better than bringing the mutant's troubles into this woman's life. "Misunderstanding? You mean the misunderstanding that you wiped out the X-Men? Do you think that will ever be settled?" the voice on the line rasped. Hey, talk nicely. I didn't wipe anyone out. No one died. I'm a gentle person, Audrey Hepburn lip-synced the words without making a sound. Then, with a playful smile on her face and a playful expression, she walked past Henry and into the kitchen. The Oscar-winning actress's glances and expressions had devastated Henry, who felt he had sunk into social ruin. He suddenly wondered if he should just wipe out the X-Men. "Let the world explode," the voice on the other end of the phone said dissatisfiedly. "If you want to be even, come and help me now. I'll see how you perform and decide whether to let you go." "Hey, big sis, are you kidding me? Our relationship isn't that close, and I don't owe you that much. There's no reason to be called whenever you call." "Oh, no, I don't have to be there just because you call. Am I being reasonable? Do I need to be reasonable? Are you crazy? Why do you think I'm being reasonable?" Suddenly, the other person's words made sense. What should Henry do? He felt inexplicably uneasy. Especially seeing Audrey Hepburn sneaking a peek from the kitchen. Her attempt to cover up something only made Henry think he should kill a few of the X-Men. Mystique on the phone continued, "Anyway, you were right before. We really have a problem here. So I need your help." Henry, looking resigned, said, "I'm used to talking nonsense. How could I be right?" "Oh, no, sister, you have a problem. Solve it yourselves. The X-Men are so impressive. They just solved a solar flare in outer space. By the way, who wrote that PR copy? It must have cost a lot of money to silence so many astrophysicists." Mystique continued, "It's just that the X-Men have a problem. There are some people I don't trust, so I need support from outside the X-Men. Besides, a lot of what you said before was true. You have to explain to me what you know." Henry, who was still trying to make excuses, was interrupted. Mystique interrupted, saying, "You owe me. At least I didn't mobilize the X-Men to come after you. If you don't come, you should know the consequences." Threatened, Henry gave up trying to reason with the woman. He said helplessly, "You have to let me know where to find you. Or are you really going to come to Switzerland to pick me up? We're on a plane, heading to..." Click. After hanging up the phone for the third time, Henry let out a little, his mood calming down a bit. "Are you going out?" Ms. Hepburn asked as she emerged from the kitchen. "Anyway, it's just a troublemaker who's caused trouble, and they're asking me to help them solve it." "This is really troublesome," Henry said reluctantly. "Want to save you dinner?" "I think not. I'll take care of it outside. I don't know how late they'll be." "Call you a taxi?" "No, it's too late for a taxi. I'll figure it out myself," Audrey Hepburn finally said. "Child, be careful." Chapter 145, Rage on the Fighter Plane. "Fuck. You hung up on me again." Mystique, clad in a yellow and blue X-suit, was aboard the X-Jet, the Blackbird. She glared fiercely at the now disconnected receiver, still attempting to hack into the satellite signal and make an international call. Hank McCoy, transformed into his Blue Beast form, urged, "Raven, are you still going to try? I really don't think asking him for help is a good idea, yet. I think it's better than someone using for someone else's good as an excuse to control their memories and thoughts regardless of their will. That guy just has a foul mouth, but at least his actions don't seem so foul right now. I told you, I was trying to protect Jean." A remorseful Professor X, resisting the urge to bite his nails, rubbed his lips repeatedly. "You should know he was still a child when it happened. Then when are you going to tell him? He's an adult, and he didn't just become an adult today. Are you going to keep this a secret forever, to keep him living in this fake world you've created? He's a human being, with his own thoughts, not a puppet on your strings." I can't find the right time, huh?" Mystique exploded, her whole body furious. Most of the X-Men aboard the Blackbird were his juniors, so they could only cower in silence, unwilling to be caught up in the storm of the boss's quarrel. Hank the Beast, the only other member of his generation, was utterly panicked, unsure what to do. Professor X was being scolded like a dog, unable to even lift his head. Just as Mystique turned back, about to continue her rant, a sudden crack interrupted her. Seeing everyone on board staring in disbelief, she turned back. That same glance startled him, too. Because a man was sprawled across the front windshield of the Blackbird. It was Henry Brown, who had hung up on him not long ago and was still in Switzerland. "How did you?" Giving up on why the man was sprawled outside the plane, Mystique turned back and said, "Nightcrawler, bring him in." Everyone's initial expressions of shock doubled, their mouths gaping open wide enough to fit a fist. Mystique turned again and saw Henry, a blurry afterimage, pass through the glass, into the cabin, and then return to normal. "How did you?" Speechless for the second time, Mystique stared at the helper she had summoned. Quicksilver, most impressed by the action, asked in astonishment, "How did you do that?" Henry replied, "Using ultra-high-frequency microvibrations to penetrate the gaps between molecules, you can achieve object movement." "Have you been studying hard?" Anyone who's studied even a little high school physics can imagine something like this. And then using your own abilities to achieve it, wouldn't that expand your capabilities? I just don't know if high schools, under the happy education model, teach this stuff. Isn't that some gifted school your X-Men base is based in? That school doesn't teach it? Then what did you learn there? Just how to control your abilities and stop yourself from harming society. Another ruthless stab pierced the frustrated Professor X, further sulking him. Unaware of who his blade had injured, Henry simply gave Quicksilver a wink. The sensible speedster immediately moved to another empty seat, vacating it. Henry plopped down in the vacant seat and addressed Mystique in the passenger seat. "Tell me, what's the reason you had to call me here? I'm not getting paid by the X-Men." "Do you get paid at all? How do you know?" Mystique demanded bluntly. "What do I know?" Henry looked bewildered. It was impossible to answer such a nonsensical question. "You know what Charles did." "Who is Charles? What did he do?" Although Henry had a rough idea in his mind, he continued to play dead. But he himself did not notice that the previous problem of pretending to be dead was already the second time. Fortunately, Mystique, who was furious, did not notice this guy's deliberate behavior, and did not want to cover up for her own people. She pointed directly at Professor X and said, "That bald guy modified other people's memories." Henry took a look to confirm Professor X's condition. He was not as young as the actor in the movie, but an old white man in his 50s. He had a bit of British aristocratic air, and if it weren't for his worn-out look, he could be said to be quite gentlemanly. But now he had a sad face and a frown on his face. Can I say it's not surprising at all, looking at Mystique staring at himself with his blue, pimpled face and a pair of severely jaundiced eyes, the power of this death stare was much stronger than that of a normal person. Henry explained, "I don't know what this Mr. Charles did. But the fact that he immediately invaded my brain the moment he heard I was an alien suggests he's someone who believes he can act with his own sense of justice. So when someone around him is in trouble, will he act cautiously, or will he uphold his inner goodness and justice and choose the course he deems most beneficial? That's why I say that good deeds by good people are sometimes more terrifying than evil deeds by evil people. This isn't a case of a hypocrite masking ill will through good deeds. Rather, some people simply don't understand the inconvenience or harm their actions cause others, so they insist on carrying out their good deeds, ultimately harming others. Professor X isn't someone who will accept criticism without retaliating. Furthermore, the other person is a stranger, unlike Raven, an old friend who knows him intimately. So Professor X retorted, "You don't understand the situation at all, so what right do you have to criticize my choices? Well, then, let me ask you, do you think medieval law, which chopped off the hands of thieves and demanded an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is correct?" Henry asked. "Of course that's wrong. The purpose of punishment should be to teach people to correct their mistakes, not to hurt them." Clapping his hands, Henry agreed, "Well said, I agree with you. But why do you think it's right to remove something from someone's head when they have bad thoughts? That's different," Professor X shouted excitedly. "What's the difference? Physical injury is injury, but mental injury is nothing. Cancer is a disease, but mental illness isn't. How do you feel about all the mental hospitals and psychiatrists across America? What do you know? I don't know anything, but at least I know you're arrogant. You still think you're right, for some reason." Henry was delighted. This kind of opportunity to lash out at Professor X didn't come around every day, and none of the other X-Men had joined in. Furthermore, having suffered a setback, Professor X didn't dare use his telepathic abilities again, so he could only hold it in. Henry, in his joy, didn't notice the situation he was facing. Chapter 146 The Original Sin of Mutants. We've arrived at Red Hook, Beast Tank. Momentarily preventing the escalation of the confrontation within the fighter jet, began the landing procedure. The X-Men's vehicle can take off and land vertically, eliminating the need for a runway. This tactical thinking, which emerged in Europe in the 1960s in response to the US-Soviet Cold War, influenced fighter jet design. To prevent runway damage and the resulting impact on aircraft takeoff and landing, countries like Britain, France, and Germany began developing fighters with vertical takeoff and landing capabilities, culminating in the British Falcon's official entry into service. Incorporating numerous cutting-edge technologies, the jet fighter developed by the mutant X-Men naturally embraced this convenient feature. However, the British Falcon, while still in its current state, suffered from limitations such as a small payload and an inability to fly supersonic. The X-Jet Blackbird, however, had no such issues, and its cabin capacity was even that of a small passenger aircraft, not a typical fighter jet. Without some advanced technology, this thing wouldn't have been possible. But Henry, seated in the plane, didn't fully appreciate or analyze this technological achievement before his eyes. Instead, he suddenly remembered what he might be facing next. The landing destination, as expected, was a typical American suburban town. All the X-Men followed Professor Xavier, who was in a wheelchair, out of the fighter. Henry was the last one to leave, peeking from the hatch. As expected, they were searching for Jean Grey, the X-Men who had strayed from the team. If this were the events of the film Dark Phoenix, then the solar flare that destroyed the Space Shuttle Endeavour was actually the Phoenix Force of the Marvel Universe. According to the film's plot, Jean Grey, having absorbed the Phoenix Force, broke free from Professor Xavier's mind shackles and remembered her parents. It turns out that in 1975, 8-year-old Jean was in a car accident, and her memories of her parents were annihilated. In reality, her father was still alive, so she ran home to find him. Little did she know that Professor Xavier had taken her in because his father's lack of understanding had made him unable to accept his daughter. This was the reason Professor Xavier had altered his memory. From this perspective, the plight of mutants is even more severe than that of black people in America. Black people are often born into single-parent families or are orphans, relying on neighborhood support to grow up safely. The environment these people grow up in and the direction they develop depends on their individual circumstances. Mutants, however, typically don't awaken their mutant abilities at birth. Rather, they develop them at some point during their development, triggered by certain stimuli. Because the transformation is drastic and uncontrollable, the first victims are often their immediate family. Unlike black people, who have mothers and the support of their neighbors. The most tragic aspect of mutants is that they are often the most ostracized by their closest family members. So, a child already living in hell, or a child who was once in paradise but fell into hell due to the awakening of their mutant abilities, which group carries the deeper hatred? The answer is obvious. This is why Henry believes mutants are more difficult to deal with than black people, and why he has absolutely no desire to get involved. The greatest suffering of mutants is that their birth is often accompanied by betrayal, not just discrimination. Black people are able to stick together, but mutants hate even one another. How can this situation be improved? At this moment, Jean Grey faced a triple blow. First, Professor X concealed the truth, leaving her believing she was an orphan. In reality, she had a biological father, which was, in a way, a betrayal. Second, upon seeing her biological father, Jean was finally reminded that her mother's death was caused by her own uncontrolled abilities. Even more painful than the betrayal was the guilt of parricide. Third, she was abandoned by her father. She had thought her biological family would bring her more love, but instead, she found only hatred and resentment. This was yet another betrayal. Any one of these three blows could have shaken a young person whose values were still stabilizing, leaving her facing a devastating emotional trauma. And this all happened together. Add to that the recent crisis involving the Space Shuttle Endeavour, though ultimately a happy one. In the moment, Jean Grey, the key force in resolving the crisis, faced a life-or-death situation. Having survived this ordeal, she was now at her most vulnerable. After three more blows, Jean Grey is arguably at her most dangerous, most vulnerable to losing control. To truly help her, you can't resort to sheer force, beating her to the point of paralysis and then lecturing her. Proclaiming "I'm doing this for your own good" or offering some grand moral truths isn't something Jean Grey will listen to right now. Instead, it's crucial for those around her to take the time to rebuild their trust and truly redeem her. Only then can Jean Grey's soul be saved. Henry, as an outsider, has no right or place to intervene. While using love as a justification might be cliché, that's no reason Henry doesn't want to see the Kryptonian Man of Steel versus the Phoenix Force. It's not that he's scared, absolutely not. As for Henry, summoned by Mystique, it feels like he's driving a max-level character into the Novus Village, only to have the Novus Village bully tell him, "Look, the GM is right there, go beat him up, you're embarrassing a max-level character." Those who haven't been a boss before want to ask those who have, what should one do in this situation? Without deposits or stock purchases, is there still a chance of winning? Waiting online, urgent. True to his principle of not taking action unless he can talk nonsense, Henry dismounted the Blackbird but crouched behind Mystique. This made Mystique, who was looking for help, wonder who she had recruited. Professor X didn't give up on saving Jean Grey because of the sarcastic remarks he received on the fighter. Unfortunately, his cliched "we are family" rhetoric failed to convince the enraged Phoenix. Then Professor X sent Cyclops, Jean Grey's current boyfriend, to persuade her. Since the fake family ties didn't work, the real romance approach did indeed sway Jean Grey. But the American police, all was late, suddenly arrived in a grand display of 3 cars, sirens blaring. Unable to handle the intimidation, Phoenix used telekinesis to overturn 2 of the police cars, severely injuring the officers inside. Only 1 car survived. The battle ensued. Mystique didn't care whether Henry had attacked or not, her complete attention was absorbed by the battle. Cyclops' reluctance to strike hard was understandable. Storm's abilities needed to warm up, and Nightcrawler's destructive power was minimal, both being thwarted by Jean Grey. Even the speedster Quicksilver was no match for the Phoenix Force. Just as quickly as he rushed towards Jean Grey, he rolled back, even more injured, and collapsed to the ground. Chapter 147 The Kryptonian. Unlike the younger X-Men who leaped at Professor X's beckoning, Mystique was the only one who still wanted to persuade Jean Grey. She knew a fight wouldn't resolve the situation today, and she was also reluctant to engage in battle, feeling guilty about Charles' actions. So, Mystique didn't attack, cautiously approaching the Phoenix, who was on the verge of losing control. Jean Grey's behavior was exactly as Mystique hoped. As long as she didn't provoke her, she wouldn't react significantly. So, Mystique edged closer, speaking tenderly. Professor X, perhaps harboring similar unrealistic hopes, wanted to give Mystique a chance to persuade her. Or perhaps he, like a headless chicken, would give anyone who stepped forward to try a chance. To give Mystique a chance to persuade Jean Grey, Professor X even stopped the beasts ready to use their special ammunition, as well as the surviving police officers who were recklessly preparing to shoot. The mental freeze had stopped them even thinking. It's not the police's fault for being clueless. While mutants possess numerous and bizarre abilities, most will still die if struck by a bullet. Therefore, retreat wouldn't be their first thought, given their ammunition still in their chambers. However, judging by the X-Men's actions, Professor X is at a loss for words. He's not as wise and infallible as one might imagine. This world's Charles Francis Xavier seems more like a human being than the infallible mutant leader. And Mystique's attempt is doomed to fail. How could an angry woman calm down so easily? Even a woman stepping in wouldn't solve the problem. A third party, completely uninvolved in the situation and trustworthy enough to listen, is needed. Clearly, none of the people present meet these requirements. But Mystique doesn't perceive the danger, or perhaps she's taking a gamble. As he and Jean close the distance to one last step, he reaches out and touches her arm. If this attempt succeeds, the next step will be a hug. And that would likely be the end of the matter. Unfortunately, Jean Grey, besides being convulsed by her emotions, was also under the influence of the Phoenix Force, effectively crushing her from both inside and out. So, when Mystique touched her, she erupted. Like a cannonball, Mystique launched herself into the distance, plowing a deep trench in the ground and destroying everything in her path. This result dampened the fighting spirit of everyone present. Jean Grey frantically surveyed the traces she had created, hoping to see the now vanished figure and discover what had become of him. But in the end, she lacked the courage to take that step, instead using telekinesis to control herself and fly away. Whether it was for herself or the others, Professor X, utterly disappointed, released a mental restraints he had imposed on everyone. The police officer, having lost their target, paused for a moment before retracting their weapons and rushing to help their companions in the other two police cars. The beast, wielding a specialized firearm, stood bewildered. He looked at the battlefield, where Phoenix had already left, and asked the wheelchair user beside him, "What's going on? Where's Raven?" Professor X raised his hand with difficulty, pointing to the abrupt ditch. Plowed earth piled on either side, preventing him from using his wheelchair to investigate. So he had no idea what had happened to the person he worried about. The beast quickly sheathed his gun and ran down the abrupt ditch. The ditch was probably at least a kilometer long, cutting through half the town. At the end, where it practically cut through a hill, the beast finally found her. Mystique lay groaning in the pit, unable to get up on her own. The beast quickly descended and helped her to her feet. But no matter where he touched, no matter how hard he pushed, Mystique remained in pain. After finally lifting her out of the pit, another hand suddenly emerged from the bottom of the dirt. Then a second, and then the entire upper body. Like a dead body resurrected from a grave, gasping for air. Henry cursed, "Fuck, I almost suffocated." The beast finally noticed the inactive outsider and asked in surprise, "Why are you here? To take the fall?" "Why else do you think I'm being pinned down?" Henry muttered. The moment Phoenix blasted Mystique away, Henry had used his super speed to get behind her. It was no exaggeration to say that he and Phoenix had worked together to plow this magnificent ditch. The reason he didn't stand in front of Mystique and take her blow was because Henry had discovered from Jean Grey's attacks that her telekinetic attacks applied force to a specific object, rather than following an invisible trajectory. If Phoenix's telekinetic attacks were like air cannons, pushing away everyone and everything in a certain trajectory, then Henry's presence as a human shield would make sense. But as it stood, even if Henry wanted to act as a human shield and position himself between Phoenix and Mystique, the people who were supposed to be blown away would still be blown away, and Henry would remain unscathed. A true masterstroke of striking a powerful blow from afar. And judging by the trajectory Mystique was blasted into, a broken wooden stake lay directly in its path. Had nothing happened, the X-Men veteran would have been impaled on the stake like a frog skewered by an eagle. Thanks to her mutant ability to change her appearance at will, Mystique's physical strength far surpassed that of an average human, but she wasn't invulnerable, nor did she possess Wolverine's regenerative abilities. Had he been impaled on the stake, his life would have been in jeopardy. Considering he'd been summoned by Mystique, leaving him to die seemed ill-advised, so Henry acted as a cushion. The beast seemed to be so frightened by the constant stream of shock that his mind was blurry. He asked blankly, "Did you make this ditch?" Henry, emerging from the dirt, brushed off the dirt and said angrily, "That chick from your X-Men made it. It wasn't me." I was also a victim. You have the ability not to cause such serious damage, right? Beast said harshly, as if seeking a place to vent his anger, blaming this alien who didn't belong to the X-Men. Henry retorted with disdain, I remember you were a think tank, a scientist, in the X-Men. Look at this ditch in the ground. It pushed 2 people a kilometer like a cannonball and displaced a lot of soil. If that kind of force were concentrated and stopped in an instant, I'd be the one who managed it. But what would happen to the person caught between me and that chick, the one you're holding? Do I need to remind you? Chapter 148 Retreat. Raven felt limp in his arms. Although Hank hadn't examined her yet, he knew her injuries were serious. Otherwise, with her strong character, she wouldn't have acquiesced to being held, had she not passed out. If the alien hadn't retreated, hadn't plowed a deep trench to absorb the force, Raven would have been a pulpy mess against the wall. Hank knew Jean's telekinesis well, so he hadn't considered the option of being a human shield. Of course, he wouldn't have criticized her for this. Taking the fall was probably the best option. Henry saw Beast's slow realization as clever, but lacking in quick thinking. As the X-Men's liaison with the government and a logistics and equipment research scientist, Beast's character and intelligence were undeniable. But that didn't mean he possessed judgment and decisiveness in an emergency. No wonder Cyclops was the X-Men's operations leader. In person, he seemed quite indecisive. At least from the way he gazed lovingly with that ugly Beast's face at the blue-skinned woman in his arms, frowning and moaning. Henry felt nothing but anxiety for him. Henry said, Hey, men, aren't you taking her back for treatment? Or does your gaze have some healing effect? Just looking at her can heal her. Is this a new mutant ability? Beast, his intelligence now restored, finally came to his senses. He scooped Mystique up in a princess-like hug and hurriedly said, Let's get on the X-Fighter and get back to base to heal. What about you? With a long sigh, Henry said, Let's go together. Today was different from last time. Although the X-Men were in a mess, he couldn't just walk away. He had to give Mystique, who was still alive, an explanation and get her to say that things were over. Otherwise, arrests like today's might happen again and again. On the police side, although Phoenix had overturned 2 cars, the officers inside were wearing their seatbelts and luckily survived. However, they were all stuck and unable to be freed. The X-Men were overwhelmed. While no one died, Mystique and Quicksilver were seriously injured, while Cyclops, Storm, and Nightcrawler only suffered bruises. The other 3 had to clean up the mess and get Quicksilver onto the X-Men on a stretcher. The speedster was in terrible shape, having collided with a Phoenix girl whose Phoenix Force was on the verge of losing control. A conservative estimate is that he had several broken bones. Honestly, he was lucky to be alive. Henry didn't help anyone, he wouldn't die anyway. The sirens of police cars and fire trucks approaching in the distance were piercing in his ears. It was clear that follow-up police forces would be arriving soon. They really didn't show up when they should, but showed up when they shouldn't. American police officers always have impeccable timing, which is infuriating. As for the townspeople, while some of their homes were damaged by the fighting, no one was seriously injured or killed. Even Jean Grey's biological father wasn't seriously injured, merely frightened. The X-Men aren't affiliated with the police, and with Professor X unable to direct them, they practically fled, boarding X-fighters and flying back to their base beneath the Xavier School for gifted youngsters. Henry was among them. Perhaps seeing Mystique's life saved, Professor X's scowl eased considerably. At least his 50-something face no longer looked wrinkled and bitter. It wasn't until Mystique and Quicksilver were taken to the medical platform, where they were personally treated by Beast Hank, that the severity of their injuries became apparent. Quicksilver suffered multiple severe fractures throughout his body. While his recovery rate was faster than a normal person's, it wasn't as fast as the Speed Force-wielding Flash next door, and his mutant abilities weren't at the level of regeneration. Therefore, Hank estimated that after the bone reset surgery, Quicksilver would need at least 1 to 2 weeks in bed to fully recover. The only silver lining was that he didn't need nails, only a cast. Mystique was in a far worse state. Due to the immense force exerted upon her, her organs were showing signs of failure. She had been receiving IV drips non-stop since boarding the X-Fighter. Her vital signs were fluctuating, a testament to Beast's first aid skills. Even more deplorable, she remained unconscious and could still speak. Truly a dead man's mouth lives on, immortalized for eternity. Did you say I called you here just to watch the show? How do you feel about witnessing the X-Men's internal strife up close? How much do you think I should charge for admission to justify this spectacular spectacle?" Though her words were weak, they were enough for Mystique to unleash her venomous tongue on the useless helper she had summoned. Henry, leaning against the door, approached Mystique's bedside. With malicious intent, he thrust a finger into the biceps of her upper arm. "Given your sincere invitation and our thinner-than-toilet paper relationship, I'd be remiss not to come and watch this spectacle. Who'd want to sit home and watch the news when they can feast their eyes up close?" Henry said. He didn't even have to exert much force, but the pain was so intense that Mystique's skin rippled, her appearance shifting constantly. Fortunately, the mutant was incredibly resilient and didn't even cry out. She simply bared her teeth, her eyes wide, glaring at the damned alien. Driven away by the beast, Henry chuckled and continued, "Besides, do you really want me to start a fight with that chick? I don't want her to hurt me. If she does, you'll be heartbroken and even blame me. So staying silent is the best option. Besides, I only took one blow, and it left a deep chasm. You mediocre guys haven't achieved much, but you've just messed up the town, too. If I unleash my strength and fight him, regardless of who wins or loses, how much damage do you think will happen to that town? Is that what you want? Is that what the X-Men want? Or is achieving your goals more important than the lives and property of ordinary people?" No wonder some people like to lecture others from a moral high ground. There's a real pleasure in seeing them rendered speechless. Even Mystique couldn't say anything like "It doesn't matter if the town is destroyed." After a long pause, he finally blurted out, "But you watched us get beaten up," Henry said. "She's just an angry little girl. If we let her vent her anger, we'll be able to talk to her calmly and find a solution. So I think letting her beat you up is a good idea." "What kind of bullshit is that? Your brain is full of shit, and you only want to come up with this kind of plan," Mystique continued. "Of course it's useless. He's familiar with you, right? If you're familiar enough, and he beats you up badly enough, it might make him feel ashamed. As soon as that emotion arises, there's a chance we can take advantage of it and dissipate the anger in his heart." Chapter 149 Subsequent Troubles. What Henry didn't mention was that if one or two people died, Phoenix's guilt would be utterly overwhelming, and the matter would be settled. Her return would only be a matter of time. So, they shouldn't have saved this talkative female mutant before. It was like in a movie. She actually died. Mystique said angrily, "Then why don't you just take the beating yourself? You had to push us out." "Hey, the key is to make that girl feel guilty. Without that, sending a lot of heads won't help. So, what can a stranger like me do?" "I'm not as good as you," Henry said gloatingly. An agitated Cyclops finally seized the opportunity and darted out. He grabbed Henry's shirt and demanded, "What the hell do you know? Be good, close your eyes," Henry said, and with lightning speed, he yanked off Cyclops' eye patch. The frightened young man quickly closed his eyes and covered his face, cursing, "You damn bastard, you do it again." Cyclops wanted to unleash his powers and give the alien a good beating. However, he was on his own territory, in the infirmary, surrounded by his own people. Without his eye patch, he struggled to control even his vision blasts. To avoid accidentally injuring his own people, he had to close his eyes. Seeing his success once again, Henry said triumphantly, "Hey, it works." Then he threw the eye patch into Storm's hand, who was also showing signs of attacking, preventing her from attacking. Storm quickly returned the eye patch to Cyclops and helped him put it on. Fortunately, Cyclops still had some sense and did not engage in combat with the alien in the infirmary. He simply glared at him angrily. Although his eyes were invisible to others, the heaving of his chest showed that he was indeed furious. Henry then said, "I don't know the entire story, so I can only tell you what I saw. First, your companion who strayed from the group was just a terrified little girl. Calling me here for help, at most I'll provide some support and prevent any serious casualties. Has anyone ever seen someone comfort their daughter by asking the neighbors to beat her up to stop her crying? So I didn't do anything to prevent the conflict from escalating and making things even more difficult to handle. It's definitely not because I'm afraid of the Phoenix Force, absolutely not. You'll have to find a way to convince him on your own. Second, I don't know if you've noticed. It's because I haven't seen that girl many times, so I feel a little different from the last time we met. I originally thought his mutant ability wasn't obvious and wouldn't change his appearance. But this time, I've noticed more than once what feels like light flowing beneath his skin. This phenomenon accompanies his emotions. The more excited he is, the more pronounced the light becomes. And it seems this ability only causes him pain. I've seen the pained frown on his face more than once. So the best thing to do for him right now is to find him a quiet place, away from external stimuli. Time heals most emotional pain, and even physical discomfort requires time to adjust. It's just that you can't seem to do anything. There's no sign of that girl, and after he overturned 2 police cars, I don't think the government will give you much time to react. The reason why mutants seem to be accepted in this world is that they are not outside the jurisdiction of the government. Not only are there law enforcement forces equipped to deal with all kinds of mutants, but there are also special prisons dedicated to imprisoning people with all kinds of strange abilities. Even if it is an Omega-level mutant like Magneto or Professor X, as long as the right method is found, the current US government is powerful enough to deal with mutant criminals. But when encountering that kind of super-specification existence, in order to reduce casualties, assigning the X-Men to take action is the best option. So in Professor X's study, there is a hotline that directly contacts the President of the United States. Then unfortunately, Henry just used his super hearing to eavesdrop on the notice that the White House unilaterally shut down the hotline. Professor X was incompetent and furious in his office. Such performance is completely different from the image of a wise man who always gives people the wisdom of Professor X. What caused Professor X in this world to be deeply connected with the US government is still unclear. But Henry didn't want to explore this point at all. What do you think happened to Jean? The question was from Mystique, who lay in the hospital bed. Although reluctant, he still inquired about the person he cared about. Henry, however, spread his hands and said, I don't know his recent condition, so how could I possibly know what happened? My only guess is that the cause of the incident must have happened recently. He's acting more like he's overfed and needs time to digest it. It's just that the outside world has been so busy that he can't focus on dealing with his physical problems. Cyclops shouted excitedly, solar flare. It must be the solar flare Jean absorbed during the mission to save the Endeavor. If we can find a way to release it, perhaps the problem will be solved. He didn't want to discourage this optimistic young man at all. If he mistook the thing for a solar flare, he would be doomed to failure. But Henry had no obligation to tell him. Besides, he had no evidence or solution, and saying more would only make mistakes. So, Henry followed Cyclops' lead and said, Great, then your only problem now is dealing with the US government. Deal with the US government, Beast Tank said in a daze, still not realizing the seriousness of the problem. Henry said, they smashed 2 police cars. The officers weren't killed, but they're definitely injured. They also damaged property. If it were an ordinary person, knowing their identity, they would have been arrested long ago. You can't expect him to be one of you, and the government to ignore such crimes. Oh, I have to say, that ditch I dug in town was also caused by that girl's strength, so you have to help me find a solution, or pretend you know nothing. Anyway, if you want compensation or hold me responsible, I won't admit it. I'm in Switzerland now, not in the US. He thought about it, and although he didn't destroy the house, he did smash through a lot of walls and fences. Not to mention the damage to other people's yards and the damage to the asphalt road. Anyway, the question is, I'm in Switzerland. What happens in the US is none of my business. Cutting the conversation short, Henry added, do you have any other questions? If not, I'm leaving. It's best not to come to me if you have any problems in the future. Chapter 150 Action Plan. Can't you stay and help? Mystique asked resignedly. It wasn't a question of whether a scapegoat would be useful. Rather, Mystique needed more help to hold the X-Men together now that Professor X's credibility had waned, preventing the entire team from collapsing into the abyss. Compared to this guy claiming to be an alien, the Brotherhood of Mutants led by Magneto wasn't suitable. Their labels were too obvious. Neither were the kids at the gifted school. They had no combat training. After careful consideration, this guy was the perfect fit. If nothing else, he'd be a good human shield. Why should I stay? This is your family affair. If I intervene, I'll just add fuel to the fire, Henry continued to evade. Moming casually said, call me when you're fighting the aliens. I don't want to get involved in Earthling affairs, then get out. Having just faced a crushing defeat, the X-Men were dejected. So, when Henry tried to withdraw, the others didn't bother to stop him. Persuasion had failed, and he didn't want to speak a second or third time. It would have sounded like begging. Mystique's response was less than friendly. On the other hand, Mystique also had some internal concerns to share. If Henry wasn't willing to integrate and become part of the group, Then having an outsider listening in was clearly inappropriate. That's why he simply told him to get out. Henry, having received permission, was overjoyed. His peaceful life wasn't enough, so why did he have to risk everything? Superheroes don't get paid. Henry clapped his hands on Nightcrawler, the most easily startled, on the shoulder. Sure enough, it startled him. But Henry's slap was merely a warning, not a strong one. He smiled and said, "Hey, lead me out. I don't know the way down here. What if I get lost and end up somewhere I shouldn't be? Like the women's restroom or the women's locker room? Well, those places are marked. I don't think anyone would accidentally wander in," Nightcrawler said. "I'm an alien, I don't know Earth language," Henry lied. "Oh, okay. I'll take you out then," the naive Nightcrawler believed. He grabbed Henry's arm and vanished in a puff of smoke. Seeing the outsider gone, Mystique perked up. Though unable to sit up, she lay still and asked, "Where's Charles?" Storm replied, "The professor's in his office." Tisk, useless man, as someone who had witnessed the U.S. military subjecting mutants to brutal experiments, yet dared to single-handedly intrude on a national peace summit to assassinate a specific target, Trask, the leader of the Sentinel Project, Mystique was no mere henchman or assistant to the two leaders. Not only was she incredibly capable, she also held considerable weight within the mutant community. After all, during her time as a solo act, she had aided many of her fellow mutants. So, now that Professor X was unable to perform his duties, he took command without hesitation, addressing the group. "Hank, I need you to analyze what Jean absorbed." "What exactly is that thing?" "Solar flare." "Who said that?" "Jean's abilities don't include absorbing energy." "I need to know exactly what he absorbed and how it affects him," Beast said awkwardly. "But I have to take care of you," Mystique glared at him, and Beast immediately corrected himself, saying, "I'm not very familiar with astrophysics, and my previous analysis was already as far as it could go, but I know a genius who should be able to help us. The only concern is whether he'll refuse to help us because this is too simple." "Who?" Mystique asked. "Reed Richards. Is he reliable?" Mystique's implication was the other party's attitude towards mutants. Hank said bitterly, "That guy's a true genius." So in his eyes, mutants and humans are just as stupid, there's not much difference. So if we really call him in, some of his words might be rude, but they'll definitely be unintentional. It looked like another troublesome guy. Mystique said helplessly, "Never mind. As long as he can help, it doesn't matter. Just get him." "Okay, I'll try to contact him." Hank then stepped aside and made a phone call. Mystique then addressed the remaining people. "Scott, use our intelligence sources to find out Jean's whereabouts. Aurora, go to Genosha Island and find Eric and ask him if he knows anything." With a poof, Nightcrawler teleported back, right in the center of the crowd. He stared blankly at the people around him, his movements appearing somewhat bewildered. Mystique had no choice but to say, "Kurt, you go with Aurora. Go get some information," Cyclops suggested. "Raven, let me go find Eric." "Aurora will go get some information," Storm didn't particularly object. Mystique, observing, said, "Talk it over among yourselves. It's important that someone gets the job done." "Okay," the three nodded. Then they looked at each other, unsure who should speak first. Seeing this, Mystique urged, "Move, boys. Staying here won't get you anywhere." "Oh, yes," the three quickly ran out of the infirmary. Mystique, lying in bed, sighed, young man." Meanwhile, in Earth's low orbit, a discussion concerning the survival of the species unfolded on the bridge of a rogue Tiberi warship. The science officer reported to their leader, Vuko, "We've previously traced a cosmic energy that destroyed our home planet. It wasn't a cosmic weapon from a specific civilization, but rather an independent, unimaginably vast, free energy. The purpose of this energy is not limited to destruction. During the investigation, we have observed more than once the planet's landscape being changed by cosmic energy, as well as the birth of primitive life. The reason we have not touched this cosmic energy so far is simply that we do not have a definite method of utilizing it. However, the natives of this planet have given us a good demonstration, which is to use a specific individual as a container to absorb this energy. After our tracking and observation, the target can still act normally after absorbing cosmic energy, and has demonstrated abilities different from most natives. It is reasonable to speculate that after training, the target native can fully utilize the characteristics of cosmic energy. I hereby suggest that in order to rebuild the mother planet, we should take action to seize cosmic energy." Select members of our tribe as containers and completely control that cosmic energy in the hands of our Deburi people. Wu Kei looked at all the Deburi people and asked, who objects to this action? Speak up now. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.